Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the lights stay low, the voice stays gentle, and old mysteries are allowed to unfold at a human pace. Tonight, we're settling in beside one of the most famous buildings on Earth, a monument so familiar that it almost feels ordinary, which is a remarkable trick for a structure made from millions of blocks of stone, and large enough to make most of human ambition look like a weekend hobby. We're talking about the Great Pyramid of Giza, and more specifically about the spaces inside it that were not meant to be obvious, not meant to be easy, and in some cases were not even known to exist until people went looking with tools the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. Our question tonight is simple on the surface and wonderfully difficult underneath it. What was found in the Great Pyramid's hidden chambers? Before we ease into the stone and dust of it all, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something fitting about that with a story like this. The pyramid has stood through so many nights, so many dawns, so many lifetimes of people stopping to stare at it and wonder what, exactly, was sealed away inside. And now, here we are, in our own moment, asking the same thing with better flashlights and slightly more complicated machines. If you find this kind of calm exploration soothing, if you enjoy letting your mind wander through old passages and older questions, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this quiet little corner reach more people who might want a slower kind of history, especially at the end of a long day. And with that, get comfortable, settle your shoulders, let the day loosen its grip a little, and we'll make our way toward the pyramid together. The funny thing about the Great Pyramid is that almost everyone thinks they know it. Even people who do not care much for ancient history usually carry some version of it in their minds. A giant triangle of stone in the desert, a tomb for a pharaoh, one of the 7 wonders, maybe a place of curses, secret passages, hidden treasure, strange measurements, conspiracy theories or documentaries narrated in a voice that suggests a dramatic revelation is always 4 minutes away. It is one of those rare buildings that exist in 2 places at once. In the real world, heavy and complicated and weathered, and in the imagination where it has become almost too famous to see clearly. That matters because the story of hidden chambers is partly a story about expectation. People have gone into the Great Pyramid for more than 1,000 years hoping to find certain things. Gold, inscriptions, royal burials, sacred knowledge, lost records, evidence that the official story is wrong, proof that the official story is right, proof of advanced engineering, proof of divine wisdom, proof of aliens, proof of basically anything that would let them return home feeling very pleased with themselves. The pyramid has had to carry all of that, along with its own immense weight. And yet, one of the strangest truths about the Great Pyramid is that when people did get inside, what they found was often not what they expected. Many of the spaces were empty. Some of the discoveries were architectural rather than dramatic. Some were markings, shafts, cavities, voids, blockages, narrow channels, rough hidden areas above finished rooms, or large empty spaces that raised as many questions as they answered. In other words, the pyramid did not always hand over treasure. Often it handed over silence, geometry, and the kind of absence that makes human beings even more curious. That, in some ways, is more interesting. Gold tells you one kind of story. Empty space tells you another. When we say hidden chambers, it is worth slowing down for a moment and asking what we really mean. Because not every concealed space inside the pyramid was a grand secret room waiting behind a dramatic stone door. Some spaces were known passages that led to other places. Some were construction spaces, the kind of practical voids and relieving compartments that help a massive stone structure survive its own weight. Some were tiny channels so narrow that a modern person could never crawl through them. Some were discovered by early explorers with brute force and persistence. Others were found by modern engineers using robots, endoscopic cameras, thermal scans and particle physics. which is a phrase that sounds slightly unfair to the original builders, as if history were a race, and one team showed up with copper tools while the other arrived with cosmic rays. Still, that contrast is part of what makes this story so satisfying. The pyramid is ancient, but the search inside it has continued into the modern world. Medieval tunnelling, 19th century blasting, early archaeology, 20th century surveying, 21st century scanning. Different minds, different methods, same basic impulse. There is a hollow place inside the stone. We want to know what is in it. To understand why that urge became so powerful, it helps to picture the pyramid as it once was. Not the sandy, stepped, weathered giant familiar from postcards and drone footage, but the building in its original finished form. Fresh white casing stones covering the outer body. Surfaces smoother than what we see today. The structure rising with a sharpness that must have looked almost unnatural in the sun. At the top, perhaps a polished capstone or finishing element catching the light. This was not a ruin when it was built. It was not a puzzle in the modern sense. It was a finished statement, and statements that large tend to attract questions. The Great Pyramid, generally attributed to Khufu of the 4th dynasty, was already old by the time many later visitors first saw it. Even in antiquity it carried age like a second skin. Generations looked at it and knew they were looking backward across an enormous span of time. That is important because old buildings invite storytelling, but very old buildings invite projection. When the original context begins to fade, imagination moves in and rents the spare room. Some of the earliest people to go looking for hidden spaces inside the pyramid were not modern archaeologists with notebooks and conservation ethics. They were treasure seekers, rulers, opportunists, labourers, engineers, and men convinced that a monument this large simply had to contain something worth extracting. If a king built this, they reasoned, then wealth must be sealed inside. If it was sealed, then there must be a way in. If the entrance was hidden, then force, patience, or stubbornness might solve the problem. The hidden entrance to the Great Pyramid was indeed not obvious to the casual eye. The original entrance lay high on the north face, and in antiquity the casing would have helped conceal the structure's internal arrangement even more effectively. At some point, whether through memory, damage, investigation, or all three, access was gained. Later traditions famously connect a forced entry with the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century. The story, retold many times, describes workers tunnelling into the pyramid in search of treasure, hacking through limestone in the hope of finding the heart of the monument. Whether every detail of the traditional account is accurate is less important here than what it reveals about the pyramid's reputation. By that time, people already believed the interior held secrets worth violating stone for. Imagine that for a moment. The heat, the hammering, the stale air, the sound of metal and effort against blocks that had sat undisturbed for centuries upon centuries. No neat museum walkway, no safety rail, no tidy labels. Just a rough tunnel being pushed into one of the most famous structures on Earth, because someone refused to believe it could be empty, and in a sense that attitude has never fully gone away. One reason the Great Pyramid remains so fascinating is that its visible exterior promises solidity, but its interior tells a different story. Inside there are ascending and descending passages, chambers placed at different levels, corbelled ceilings, granite portcullis elements, shafts, unfinished-looking spaces, and structural features that seem at once practical and ceremonial. There is the so-called King's Chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, the subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock below, the grand gallery rising with its extraordinary form, the well shaft, the grotto area, the small channels leading outward or upward from chambers, and above at least one major room, a series of hidden relieving spaces not intended for ordinary access. In other words, even the known interior is already a lesson in how misleading the word simple can be. That complexity is what gave hidden discoveries their power. The pyramid was not merely a solid mountain of stone with one burial room stuck in the middle. It had layers. It had internal logic. It had places where weight was redirected, places where movement was controlled, places where the visible route and the concealed spaces interacted in ways that still provoke argument. Once you realise that, you begin to understand why people kept suspecting there must be more, and sometimes there was. But before we get into the specific finds, there is another point worth settling quietly into place. Not every find inside the Great Pyramid was an object. Modern storytelling often trains us to think in terms of reveal scenes. A team peers into darkness. A torch beam lands on a golden artifact. Someone breathes, "My God." Music swells. Cut to commercial. The real history is both less theatrical and more impressive. Sometimes the discovery was a chamber itself. Sometimes the find was a construction technique. Sometimes it was a set of quarry marks painted in red ochre by workers. Sometimes it was a blocking stone at the end of a narrow shaft. Sometimes it was a previously unknown void detected only indirectly by measuring how particles from space pass through the stone. Not all discoveries glitter. Some simply rearrange what we thought we knew. And that is where the Great Pyramid becomes especially good company for a quiet evening, because it teaches patience. It resists the cheap thrill. It rewards the person willing to look twice. Think about the phrase hidden chamber. It sounds dramatic, and sometimes it should. But hidden can mean many things. A room above a ceiling, sealed behind masonry, is hidden. A narrow shaft no wider than a loaf of bread is hidden in a different way. A void too large to ignore but impossible to enter without damaging the monument is hidden in yet another way. Even an obvious chamber can be hidden historically if nobody understands what it was for. The pyramid offers all these kinds of hiddenness at once: physical concealment, functional ambiguity, historical silence. That last one matters because the Great Pyramid is famous not only for what is inside it, but for what is not. Unlike later Egyptian tombs rich with wall texts and images, the main chambers of the Great Pyramid are strikingly bare. No colourful narrative scenes, no long religious compositions covering every surface, no lavish burial equipment sitting where one might expect to find it. The central granite coffer in the king's chamber is there, yes, but the room does not present itself like a crowded royal treasure house frozen in time. This absence has fueled endless speculation. Was it robbed? Was it symbolic rather than literal? Was it always meant to be sparse? Are we looking at a monument whose purpose was partly different from what later royal tombs became? These are old questions, and tonight we do not need to solve them all. In fact, we should be careful with that instinct. The pyramid tends to punish overconfidence. For every solid observation, there are 10 eager theories standing nearby in fancy clothes. Better to move carefully. Better to ask what was found before we leap into what every find must mean. So let us stand for a moment at the threshold of the whole problem. A structure built around 4,500 years ago still commands attention, not only because of its size, but because it is internally selective. It reveals some things and conceals others. It offers corridors but withholds explanation. It contains rooms but few words. It is explored, measured, photographed, scanned, mapped, modelled, argued over, and still capable of producing new surprises. Most buildings eventually become easier with time. The Great Pyramid has done the opposite. The more precisely it is examined, the more carefully we have to speak. There is also something almost funny in the way hidden spaces inside the pyramid provoke such certainty in people who have not met one another and would not agree on lunch, let alone archaeology. One person says the hidden chambers must hold royal archives. Another says they must be symbolic air passages. Another says they hide a lost library, a machine, a tomb, a star map, a secret initiation route, evidence of stolen history, or a room that somehow explains everything. Human beings can look at a cavity in stone and turn it into a complete worldview before anyone has even fitted a camera through the gap. It is one of our more energetic habits. But this is where the calm approach becomes useful. We do not need the pyramid to explain everything. We only need to listen to what the evidence actually says. That may sound less exciting than speculation, but in practice it is often stranger. Because the real discoveries inside the Great Pyramid are already remarkable. Spaces above chambers that helped protect a room from collapse. Painted work marks tucked away where few eyes were meant to linger. Tiny doors or blocking stones deep inside narrow channels. A large internal void revealed not by breaking through walls, but by reading invisible particles from the sky. You do not need to invent wonder when the actual record contains that. And perhaps that is one reason this monument has lasted so well in the imagination. It balances on the line between accessibility and refusal. You can visit it. You can walk into major parts of it. You can learn its basic layout, and yet you cannot quite finish knowing it. There is always one more angle, one more gap above a ceiling, one more corridor too tight for the body, one more scan result that reopens an old question. The pyramid allows contact but not completion. That is rare. Most mysteries lose power when you shine enough light on them. The Great Pyramid often becomes more interesting. It helps too that stone itself has a peculiar effect on the mind. A wooden building feels mortal. Brick feels practical. Glass feels modern. But vast ancient stone feels patient. It does not hurry to tell you what it is. It doesn't explain itself because you have arrived with opinions. You stand in front of it and realize very quickly that it has already outlived civilizations, languages, empires, religions, maps, and a truly depressing number of confident men with chisels. That perspective tends to quiet the room a little, so when people entered the interior and found chambers, passages and concealed architectural features, they were not just cataloguing empty spaces, they were crossing into the thinking of another age. Even if some of those spaces were practical, they were practical within a worldview we only partly recover. The line between engineering and meaning was not necessarily drawn where we would draw it. A relieving chamber above a burial room can be structural and still exist inside a sacred monument. A shaft can serve one function, several functions, or one function that changed in meaning over time. A hidden space can be technically ordinary and symbolically charged at once. This is one reason arguments about the pyramid never die. People keep trying to force single answers out of a monument that may never have operated in a single register. For now, though, it is enough to say this. The hidden chambers of the Great Pyramid are not one thing. They are a collection of discoveries made across centuries by different methods, each adding a piece to the internal map of the monument. Some of those discoveries concern rooms above known chambers. Some concern narrow shafts extending from interior spaces. Some concern deeper parts of the pyramid's internal roots. Some concern voids detected without direct entry. Some are ancient features only recognized later for what they represented. And some concern what was not found, which is sometimes the most unsettling result of all. Because absence changes the story. If you expect a treasure room and find a bare chamber, that emptiness becomes evidence. If you expect decorative inscriptions and find plain stone, that plainness becomes evidence. If you expect a fully understood plan and discover another concealed void, uncertainty becomes evidence. The pyramid does not merely contain objects and spaces, it contains limits. And historians, archaeologists, engineers and dreamers all end up working against those limits in their own ways. Tonight we're going to walk through those discoveries slowly. We will look at the known spaces and the ones hidden above them. We will examine the markings left by workers, the odd little channels that keep inspiring debate, the blocked paths that modern robots approached like cautious insects, and the great internal void that emerged not from a dramatic breach, but from data, patience, and technology, sensitive enough to read the monument without smashing it apart. We will also keep asking a quieter question, underneath the obvious one. When the pyramid gives us emptiness, what are we supposed to do with that? For many people, emptiness is a disappointment. They want the room to contain the thing, but ancient monuments are often more subtle than that. A hidden space can matter because it reveals method, design, stress management, planning, ritual route, symbolic arrangement, or a deliberate withholding of access. In architecture, a void is not always a lack. Sometimes it is a decision, and the Great Pyramid is full of decisions. Some of them were made by builders solving immense practical problems. How do you raise and place stone at this scale? How do you control load? How do you preserve an internal chamber under the pressure of masonry above? How do you shape passages with precision? How do you conceal and reveal access? How do you coordinate labour so that different parts of the monument align into a coherent whole? These are engineering decisions and they matter. Others may have been ceremonial, royal, cosmological or symbolic. We have to be cautious here, but not blind. Ancient Egyptian monuments were not built in an emotional vacuum. They were saturated with ideas about kingship, death, the heavens, rebirth, order, and continuity. The difficulty is not deciding whether meaning exists. The difficulty is learning where the evidence lets us place it. That, in a way, is our task as well. To stay curious without becoming gullible. To stay open without floating away. To let the pyramid be impressive without demanding that it become magical on command. So as we begin, keep in mind that the answer to our title question will not be a single dramatic sentence. It will be a layered answer, fitting for a layered monument. What was found in the Great Pyramid's hidden chambers? Structural spaces were found, marks were found, narrow shafts and their blockages were found. Previously unknown internal voids were found, empty rooms were found, architectural intelligence was found. Silence was found too, and that silence has been one of the most powerful discoveries of all, because it forced every generation after to return with another question, another instrument, another theory, another breath held in the dark. And before we can appreciate the hidden places, we need to look more carefully at the monument people think they already know, the one rising over Giza in broad daylight, familiar in outline and deeply unfamiliar once you step inside. Because the real mystery does not begin with the latest scan or the latest speculation. It begins with the fact that even the visible pyramid is already stranger than most people realise, and the first thing we need to do is stand before it properly, not as an icon, but as a building with an inside. Most people meet the Great Pyramid long before they know anything real about it. They meet it in school books, on television, in logos, in travel posters, in documentaries with dramatic music, in jokes about ancient aliens, in lists of wonders, in little gold souvenirs sold in airport shops, and in that very specific kind of stock photo where a camel is standing in the foreground, looking as if it personally approved the Fourth Dynasty. By the time someone finally starts reading about the monument itself, the shape is already so familiar that it can feel less like a building and more like a symbol. That is the first trick the pyramid plays. It becomes famous enough to hide its own reality in plain sight, because the Great Pyramid is not just a giant stone triangle sitting in the desert. It is a built interior. It has roots, turns, heights, low ceilings, rough cuts, finished surfaces, block spaces, cramped passages and chambers placed in ways that still make people argue. It has parts that feel ceremonial and parts that feel brutally practical. It has sections that tourists know about and sections that specialists spend years thinking about. It has spaces that were entered centuries ago and spaces nobody has physically entered at all. When people picture the Great Pyramid, they usually picture the outside. But the reason the monument has never stopped pulling at the imagination is that the inside refuses to behave like a simple tomb. That contrast matters more than it first seems. On the outside, the pyramid looks like the most straightforward shape in architecture. 4 sides, 1 point, immense size, clear intention. It seems final. It seems stable. It seems as if you could understand it from a distance in about 6 seconds. Then you begin learning about the interior, and the whole thing changes character. Suddenly there is a descending passage cutting down into the rock beneath the pyramid. There is an ascending passage branching upward. There is the Grand Gallery, a tall and very strange interior corridor that does not feel like an afterthought or a storage closet. There is the so-called Queen's Chamber, set in the body of the pyramid. There is the so-called King's Chamber higher up, built in granite, with hidden relieving spaces above it. There are narrow shafts extending from chambers. There is a subterranean chamber below ground level. There is a well shaft connecting parts of the internal system. There are features that appear functional, others that appear symbolic, and some that could easily be both. That is when the monument stops being a postcard and starts being a problem. If you stood in front of the Great Pyramid with no knowledge of its internal plan, you would not guess most of what lies within it. That is not because the builders were trying to create a puzzle for modern audiences, although they have accidentally done a fine job of that. It is because the building was designed from the outside in and the inside out at the same time. The visible mass and the concealed arrangement belong to one plan. The inner spaces are not decorations inserted later. They are part of the logic of the structure. That seems obvious once stated, but it is easy to forget. We tend to treat the exterior as the main event and the interior as extra information. In reality, the interior is part of what the pyramid is, and yet, the interior is exactly what most people never really picture. Ask someone to describe the Great Pyramid, and they will usually tell you about its scale. They might mention Khufu. They might say it was once the tallest human-made structure in the world. They might talk about casing stones, slave labour, treasure, curses, alignments, missing capstones, or how hot it must be out there. What they often will not describe is the experience of moving inside it. Not the symbolic idea of it, but the actual physical experience. The low angle of a passage, the need to bend, the pressure of stone around you, the sense that the building is not hollow in a comfortable way, but selectively hollow in a controlled and purposeful way. That is one reason interior discoveries carried so much force. They made the pyramid feel alive again as architecture. Not alive in the supernatural sense, just alive as a constructed environment. Every newly understood space reminded people that this enormous mass was not simply piled up. It was organised. The outside of the pyramid encourages simplification because it presents such a clean statement. But the original exterior would have simplified it even more. Today, people see the stepped core where casing stones are missing, and that roughness tells the eye something about layers and construction. In antiquity, much more of the outer casing remained. The surfaces would have been smoother, cleaner, more visually unified. The monument would have looked even less like something with internal complications, and even more like a pure, geometric decision imposed on the landscape. That probably strengthened the sense that whatever lay inside was fully sealed away from the world. There is also the issue of scale, which distorts human intuition. Smaller buildings often make their interiors legible from the outside. A house tells you roughly where the rooms must be. A church suggests a nave, an apse, a roof line, a volume you can imagine. The Great Pyramid does not offer that courtesy. Its mass is so large and so dense that interior spaces could be placed within it almost like thoughts inside a mind. A corridor can rise through the body of the stone without announcing itself. A chamber can sit at a particular level with no exterior sign visible to a casual observer. A void can exist above a ceiling and leave no obvious trace outside. The building is big enough to swallow internal complexity whole. That is part of why people have always suspected more. A monument of that scale feels as if it should contain secrets simply because it contains so much stone. Human beings have a hard time looking at a massive structure without assuming that the volume must be doing something. We do not like the idea of unused interior mass. We want it to justify itself. We look at the pyramid and think, surely not all of that can just be there to hold shape. Surely there must be hidden rooms, deeper meanings, extra chambers, something tucked into that volume besides the spaces already known. Sometimes that instinct is wrong, sometimes it is right. But it is a very old instinct. There is another reason most people never really see the interior in their minds. The names are misleading: King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, Grand Gallery, Subterranean Chamber. These labels are useful, but they can quietly give the impression that the internal map is settled in a way it is not. The so-called Queen's Chamber, for example, was almost certainly not identified that way by its builders. The name is modern tradition, not ancient certainty. The King's Chamber is more central to discussions of burial, but even there the questions do not end. Labels make a place feel known. Sometimes they only make it easier to talk about what we do not fully understand. The same is true of the phrase hidden chamber. It makes the public imagine one kind of thing: a dramatic secret room concealed behind stone, untouched for ages, perhaps waiting with artifacts inside. The Great Pyramid does contain concealed spaces, but many of them do not fit that cinematic image. Some are above-known chambers, some are narrow shafts too small for a person, some are voids whose existence can be detected before anyone sees their full shape directly. Some are transitional spaces within the monument's broader internal design. If you approach the pyramid expecting only treasure room logic, you miss what makes it interesting as architecture. And architecture is the right word here, even though the pyramid is often spoken about as if it were a single solid object rather than a designed experience. Someone had to decide where bodies would move and where they would not. Someone had to decide which roots rose and which descended. Someone had to shape the proportions of the Grand Gallery, which is one of the most unusual interior spaces in ancient monumental building anywhere. Someone had to determine that the upper granite chamber needed protection from the immense weight above it, and devise a solution involving multiple spaces stacked over the ceiling. Someone had to place those little shafts within the structure with careful angles and consistent direction. Whether all of those choices were purely functional, partly symbolic, or deeply tied to royal and religious ideas is still debated. What is not debated is that the interior was planned. That may sound basic, but it is worth sitting with, because it changes the emotional feel of the monument. Once you stop thinking of the Great Pyramid as just an exterior shell and start thinking of it as a designed set of internal decisions, it becomes much stranger. The builders were not simply raising a mountain. They were composing hiddenness. Even known spaces inside the pyramid carry that feeling. The descending passage is not generous. It leads downward into the bedrock toward the unfinished-looking subterranean chamber, and it does so with a low ceiling and a long-controlled geometry. It feels deliberate, not casual. The ascending passage branches away, as though the monument contains options or layers of access. Then the Grand Gallery rises with a heightened form that surprised nearly everyone who first sees it. It is not just a tunnel. It is an interior statement. It feels engineered, yes, but it also feels staged, almost as if movement through it was meant to matter. Then the roots narrow again. Then chamber spaces open. Then the sense of where you are inside all that stone becomes hard to hold in ordinary terms. This is where the monument's fame can become a disadvantage. People think they know it because they know the silhouette, but the silhouette tells you almost nothing about the experience of being inside it. And once you lose the interior, you also lose the basic reason hidden spaces would matter. A hidden chamber is exciting only because it belongs to a building whose insides are already unusual. That is also why early accounts from those who entered the pyramid often sound so captivated. Even when methods were rough and motives were not especially noble, people were reacting to a structure that did not feel like a normal human interior. There are no sunlit halls in there, no friendly windows, no decorative reliefs to keep you company. Much of the pyramid's internal world is stone, angle, pressure, and silence. It is not an easy monument in sensory terms. It withholds comfort. A corridor is just a corridor, until you remember it has been held inside a giant mound of masonry for thousands of years. Then even simple spaces feel charged. The Great Pyramid has also been helped, in a strange way, by being partly empty. A richly decorated tomb explains itself more quickly. It gives you names, gods, scenes, spells, and visual clues. The Great Pyramid's major chambers are far less talkative. That silence has done a lot for its reputation. Since the walls do not explain the building in any easy way, later generations have filled the quiet with their own ideas. Sometimes those ideas are thoughtful. Sometimes they are ridiculous. Usually they are a bit of both. But the absence of obvious explanation has kept attention fixed on the interior, and absence is not the same thing as nothing. Take the King's Chamber, for example. Even people who have heard of it often imagine it as the final destination, and therefore the full explanation of the monument. But the chamber is only one part of the interior system. It matters immensely, yet it does not dissolve the surrounding questions. Above it are the relieving chambers, hidden spaces that many casual observers never learn about at all. These were not grand ceremonial rooms. They were structural spaces stacked above the granite ceiling to reduce or redirect the load from the vast masonry above. That is an extraordinary thing to find inside a monument already so impressive. Not treasure, not a mural, but engineering intelligence concealed above a room that itself sits deep within the building. And in those hidden spaces were also found the famous quarry marks in red, inscriptions left by work crews, among the most important pieces of evidence tied to the construction history of the pyramid. That alone should be enough to convince anyone that the spaces most people never see are often more revealing than the famous ones they do. The same goes for the shafts leading from the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber. These narrow channels were not obvious in every case, and their interpretation has been debated for generations. Air shafts is the common phrase, though that description can be misleading or incomplete depending on which shaft and which theory one is discussing. Some reach the outer face of the pyramid, others were found blocked. Their size makes them feel intimate in a very odd way, as if the building contains these thin lines of intention drawn through stone. They are not spaces for human movement, yet they are clearly part of the plan. That alone makes them fascinating. Buildings do not usually contain long, narrow features for no reason, especially not at this scale and with this degree of precision. Modern discoveries have only widened that gap between public image and internal reality. Many people still imagine that the pyramid's secrets were either discovered long ago or probably do not exist. Then a modern scanning project reveals a major internal void, large enough to demand attention, and suddenly the old monument becomes new again. Not new in age, obviously. The stones are not freshening up, but new in human understanding. A structure people thought they broadly understood turns out to contain a significant space not previously mapped in full. That is the sort of development that reminds us how partial our picture has been all along. It also helps explain why the Great Pyramid remains uniquely irritating to people who want closure. Closure is difficult when the building still produces data that complicates its own story. You can say it is a royal pyramid, and that is fair. You can say it was built with immense skill in the Old Kingdom, also fair. You can point to the internal chamber system, the granite coffer, the construction methods, the orientation, the context at Giza. All of that is grounded. But then the hidden and little seen spaces begin tugging at the edges. Why this void here? Why that shaft there? Why this structural solution? Why so much internal sophistication in a monument whose outside seems so direct? The answers may be ordinary in some cases, but ordinary does not mean uninteresting. It just means the builders were thinking in ways we still have to reconstruct. There is a temptation, when discussing the pyramid, either to flatten it into certainty or inflate it into fantasy. Neither approach really sees the monument. Flattening says it is just a tomb, end of story, nothing to discuss. Fantasy says it must be a machine, a code book, a supernatural device, or evidence of visitors who never seem to leave behind paperwork. The real pyramid sits somewhere harder and more satisfying. It is a royal monument built in a specific historical context, and also an architectural creation whose internal spaces are more intricate, more selective, and in some respects more surprising than popular culture usually admits. That is enough. You do not need nonsense to make it compelling. And perhaps that is why the spaces most people never see matter so much. They protect the monument from becoming a cliché. The outer form is almost too famous. The hidden interior saves it from simplification. Imagine two visitors. One stands on the plateau, takes a photograph, says something appreciative about ancient engineering, and leaves with the same basic idea they arrived with. The other begins reading about the internal layout, the passages, the hidden relieving chambers, the blocked shafts, the subterranean route, the modern scans, the way discoveries have been made over time. These two people are not really leaving with the same pyramid. The first has seen an icon, the second has met a structure. This difference shapes how every later discovery is received. If the pyramid is just a giant tomb, then hidden spaces are minor additions. If the pyramid is a carefully organised internal world concealed inside a seemingly simple form, then each hidden space becomes another clue to the builder's priorities. Even the absence of objects becomes meaningful. A chamber without treasure is not empty of significance. It may be telling you that the design itself mattered. A void without immediate access is not useless knowledge. It may show how much we still do not see. A rough relieving space above a polished chamber may reveal the practical mind behind the ceremonial one. In that sense, the Great Pyramid is one of the best examples in history of a monument whose unseen parts do a great deal of its intellectual work. The outer mass inspires awe. The hidden spaces create obsession. This is probably why every generation returns to it with its own tools. Medieval tunnellers brought force. Early explorers brought daring and sometimes a regrettable enthusiasm for breaking things. Archaeologists brought documentation. Engineers brought measurement. Robotic teams brought cameras small enough to move where people could not. Physicists brought muon detection and turned the sky itself into a kind of X-ray source. Different centuries, same impulse. There is more in there. Let's see how much more we can learn without losing the monument in the process. That last point matters because the pyramid does not surrender easily, and that is probably for the best. There was a time when hidden spaces were found by smashing through stone and hoping history forgave the method later. Now the search is more careful, or at least it tries to be. That shift has changed what counts as discovery. Sometimes the most important find is no longer an artifact pulled into daylight, but a measured anomaly, a scan result, a mapped cavity, or a blocked line inside the structure that suggests intent. In other words, the things most people never see are often not just physically hidden, they are conceptually hidden too. You need some patience to appreciate why they matter. And patience is exactly what the Great Pyramid demands. It asks you to move beyond the silhouette, beyond the souvenir, beyond the easy phrase, one of the wonders of the world, and to reckon with a building that keeps its most interesting arguments inside itself. The monument everyone knows is only half the story. The rest lies in the passages, cavities, shafts, upper spaces, concealed chambers, and quiet structural decisions that rarely make it into the simplified version. Once you realise that, the whole building shifts. It stops being a giant symbol in the desert and becomes something much more impressive. A place with an inside still capable of surprising us. And before we get to the later scans and the modern mysteries, we need to go back to the earliest openings, to the first attempts to force the stone to speak, and to the people who entered expecting riches and found a very different kind of treasure. For most of the pyramid's life, the question was not what modern instruments might detect inside it, but how anyone could get into it at all. That is easy to forget now, because the Great Pyramid has been photographed from every angle, mapped in detail, entered by tourists, described in guidebooks, and discussed so often that it can feel permanently open in the public imagination. but for long stretches of time, access was uncertain, difficult, dangerous, and surrounded by rumour. A monument that looks so solid from the outside naturally encourages a certain kind of thinking. If something this large was built for a king, then surely something valuable must have been sealed inside. If it was sealed, then the entrance must be hidden. If it was hidden, then somewhere in all that stone there had to be a weakness, a forgotten root, a clue, a joint, a hollow sound, a place where force and luck might meet. That line of thinking is older than archaeology and much less polite. Long before people arrived with survey equipment, conservation rules, and patient diagrams, the Great Pyramid attracted another kind of visitor: men who wanted in. Some came out of curiosity, some out of ambition, some out of greed, and most with a mixture of all three. The pyramid had a reputation before anyone living truly understood it. It was already ancient, already famous, already large enough to make people assume that its interior must hold something worthy of the effort required to breach it. That assumption drove the first major openings, and in a strange way it still shapes the whole modern conversation. Because once the idea takes root that a monument is hiding something, every stone begins to look like a locked door. The best-known story of the first forced opening centres on the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century, usually dated to around 820 CE. The account comes to us through layers of later retelling, and not every detail can be treated as firm fact in the modern sense. But the story became so influential because it captures something true about the period and about the monument itself. A powerful ruler or ruler's agents, convinced that the Great Pyramid contained hidden treasure or secret knowledge, ordered men to break into it. That basic idea has endured because it makes sense. If you stand before the pyramid and believe it is sealed, you do not walk away thinking, perhaps this vast royal monument contains nothing at all. You think, someone hid the good stuff well. The practical problem was obvious. The Great Pyramid was designed to resist casual entry. Its original entrance sat on the north face, high above ground level, and in antiquity the outer casing would have made the structure even cleaner and harder to read. A Finnish pyramid was not eager to explain its openings to strangers. Even if the approximate location of the original entrance was suspected or known in some traditions, the monument's scale and stonework still made access difficult. Tunnelling offered a brutal solution. If the entrance could not be easily found or confidently reached, one could simply cut a new route inward. That is where the famous Robber's Tunnel, often associated with Al-Ma'mun, enters the story. To this day, visitors typically enter the Great Pyramid through that rough-forced passage rather than through the original ancient entrance. There is something very revealing about that. The route most modern people use to step into one of the world's greatest monuments is not the carefully designed ceremonial or official entry imagined by the builders, but a scar carved by later intruders trying to get at whatever they believed was sealed inside. It is an accidental reminder that the history of the pyramid is not only the history of construction, it is also the history of pursuit. Imagine the work involved in making that breach, not abstractly, but physically. Men in a confined space, hammering into limestone, listening for changes in sound, trying to keep direction within an enormous body of stone, heat building, dust thickening, light poor, progress slow. Every strike carrying the promise that just beyond the next section might lie a chamber full of wealth, an open corridor, a cache of royal goods, or at the very least proof that the labour had not been foolish. It was not elegant work. It was not careful by modern standards, but it was not random either. The tunnel did eventually intersect with the ascending passage system, suggesting that the diggers either had some sense of where they hoped to break through or benefited from a combination of reasoning and fortune strong enough to pass into legend. That moment, when a forced tunnel meets the inner layout of the pyramid, is one of the most important turning points in the monument's afterlife. Before that, the pyramid was a sealed body. After that, it became an entered one, not fully understood, certainly not fully documented, but opened in a way that changed everything. Once access existed, even rough access, the internal spaces ceased to be matters of pure imagination. They became places that could be described, measured, looted, misread, revisited, and argued over. And what people found was not what treasure stories had trained them to expect. This is one of the most important patterns in the history of the Great Pyramid. The effort to get inside was driven by expectation of riches, but the interior kept offering something else. Passages, chambers, stonework, emptiness, and puzzles. That did not mean the interior was unimportant. Quite the opposite. It meant the significance of what was there was not simple to read. If a person entered hoping for obvious wealth, the monument could seem disappointing. If a person entered capable of noticing architecture, construction, and concealment, it could seem extraordinary. The earliest forced opening and the traditions around it sit right at that divide. In later medieval stories, some accounts embroidered the tale with fabulous objects, statues, strange artifacts, writings, preserved bodies, marvellous treasures, or esoteric knowledge sealed before the flood. These stories tell us more about the expectations people brought to the pyramid than about the reliable contents of its chambers. A monument this old and this imposing almost demanded mythic rewards. The imagination does not like to think of immense effort ending in stone rooms and a granite coffer. It wants gold. It wants revelation. It wants to feel that the world hid something dramatic and that bold men dragged it into daylight. But the actual history of entering the pyramid is more sobering and in its own way more interesting. The main interior spaces that became known were not crowded with grave goods. The so-called King's Chamber held the granite coffer, yes, but not a visible intact royal burial complete with treasures. The major chambers did not present themselves like the richly furnished tomb scenes later generations might have expected from popular ideas about Egypt. That absence was crucial. It shaped every later suspicion. Either the pyramid had been robbed long before the medieval opening many concluded, or it had served a purpose more complicated than a treasure-filled tomb, or perhaps it held additional sealed spaces still untouched. Once the first opening failed to settle the matter, the monument's mystery deepened rather than shrank. That is often how difficult buildings behave. They do not reward intrusion with closure. The forced tunnel itself says a great deal about the mentality of the searchers. It was not enough to admire the pyramid from outside. They needed to convert wonder into access. This is a very human impulse. We do not like sealed things. A sealed room suggests a choice we were not included in. A blocked passage feels like a statement made against us personally, even when it was built thousands of years before our grandparents' grandparents existed. The Great Pyramid, with its hidden entrance and massive body, was almost designed to provoke that response. Even if the builders intended practical security, ritual control, or simple monumental finality, later viewers felt the same basic irritation. Stone was keeping them from an answer, and once one tunnel existed, the whole logic of the monument changed for later explorers. Knowledge spreads. Roots become known. What was once an act of breaking becomes an act of following. People began moving through the interior, describing it, revising earlier descriptions, comparing stories, and adding fresh layers of interpretation. The pyramid's sealed mystery became a travelled mystery. Still hard, still dangerous in places, still confusing, but no longer wholly closed. It is worth pausing on the historical atmosphere surrounding these early entries. The medieval Islamic world did not approach ancient Egypt as a blank landscape. Egypt was full of monumental ruins, inscriptions, stories, legends, and memories half preserved through local tradition and literature. Ancient structures attracted wonder and speculation. Some were associated with antediluvian knowledge, with kings of immense wisdom, with hidden sciences, with magical protection, with ancient records, or with treasures concealed against catastrophe. The pyramids, standing above everything else in size and reputation, naturally drew the strongest versions of these ideas. To enter one was not only to look for valuables, it could also mean searching for knowledge imagined to be older than ordinary history. That does not make every story trustworthy. Far from it. But it helps explain why the Great Pyramid was treated not merely as a tomb, but as a vault of possibility. People often assume modern conspiracy culture invented the urge to turn pyramids into storehouses of lost wisdom. It did not. That urge is old. Human beings have been looking at ancient sealed monuments and assuming they contain answers for a very long time. And yet, once inside, the actual spaces have a way of sobering the mind. The descending passage is too controlled to feel accidental. The ascending route feels planned. The Grand Gallery is too unusual to dismiss. The chambers are too deliberate. The whole arrangement tells you that this is not a crude pile of stone hiding a treasure box. It is a designed internal system. Even an intruder focused on loot would have felt that. The architecture itself begins to take over the conversation. One can imagine the emotional shifts of those first entrants. Excitement at the breach, expectation of wealth, confusion at the passage layout, tension in narrow spaces, surprise at the height of the Grand Gallery, anticipation at reaching the major chambers, then, perhaps, disappointment at the lack of obvious treasure. Then a second kind of fascination, harder to name. If not riches, then what exactly had all this been for? Why such care? Why this arrangement? Why chambers here and not there? Why granite in one place and limestone in another? Why would a king's monument conceal its inner structure in this way, and then seem so restrained in what it displayed? These are questions that emerge naturally once access replaces imagination. The first openings did not solve the pyramid. They transformed the puzzle from fantasy into architecture. There is also the matter of damage, which cannot be ignored. Early entry by tunnelling, prying and forcing routes inevitably altered the monument. The robber's tunnel is itself an intervention that remains part of how the building is experienced. Later exploration in other periods was not always gentle either. For centuries, the line between exploration, treasure hunting, and destruction could be thin. People removed casing stones from pyramids and other structures for later building projects. Interior features suffered from rough handling. The modern ideal of preserving every context carefully is relatively recent. Earlier generations often behaved as though ancient stone existed to be mined for answers quickly and physically. This makes the Great Pyramid slightly tragic as well as fascinating. Some things may have been lost before anyone had the discipline to record them properly. If valuables were once present, they vanished long before reliable modern observation. If certain routes or seals existed in a more intact form, some may have been broken or altered by the very people trying to understand them. The first openings gave knowledge, but they also changed the object of knowledge. Still, those openings mattered enormously, because they created the first real bridge between the sealed monument and later inquiry. Without them, the interior plan might have remained far more obscure for much longer. Later scholars, travellers, and investigators could follow routes that had already been forced or rediscovered. They could compare the rough tunnel with the original passages. They could begin distinguishing between ancient design and later intrusion. That distinction became vital. The more one studies the pyramid, the more important it becomes to separate what the builders intended from what later centuries did to the structure. This is one reason the story of Al-Ma'mun's tunnel is not merely a colourful anecdote. It is part of the monument's internal history. The breach is now part of the lived reality of entering the pyramid. It is a reminder that access came through conflict between later human desire and earlier architectural control. The builders sealed and arranged. Later generations broke and probed. The modern visitor inherits both, and the hunt for what was sealed did not end when the first major route in was made. If anything, it intensified. Once it was known that the pyramid contained major chambers but not obvious surviving treasure, the search shifted in tone. people began wondering whether the true prize had been removed earlier, whether undiscovered chambers still existed, whether the visible rooms were only part of the plan, whether blocked passages concealed more, whether upper or lower cavities remained beyond reach. In other words, the first opening did not satisfy greed or curiosity. It refined them. That refinement is important. At first, the question is simple. Can we get in? Once inside, the question becomes more complicated. What counts as in? Is reaching one chamber enough? Is the first obvious room the goal? Or is the goal the last sealed space? If the main chamber is empty, does that mean there is nothing left? Or does it mean we have not yet reached the right place? The Great Pyramid encourages exactly this kind of mental escalation. Every answer seems to reveal another layer. That helps explain why the monument remained a target for continued exploration through later centuries. Travellers described the passages, scholars attempted measurements, explorers looked for anomalies, engineers studied the layout. Each generation inherited not only the pyramid, but the unresolved mood created by those first openings. Somewhere in this stone something was hidden. Perhaps much had already been found. Perhaps not enough had been found. Either way, the monument did not feel exhausted. Even the empty granite coffer in the king's chamber contributed to that atmosphere. A large stone box in a chamber deep inside a colossal monument should have answered a great many questions. Instead, because it stood without a visible burial and without a lavish scene surrounding it, it intensified them. Was the burial removed in antiquity? Very likely, many would say, but certainty is difficult. And even if robbery explains the absence of goods, it does not explain every architectural choice surrounding the chamber system. So the search widened again, mentally, if not always physically. Maybe the real secrets lay above, below, beside, or beyond the known route. Here we begin to see why later discoveries of hidden spaces were so powerful. The first forced entry had already taught everyone a lesson. The inside of the pyramid was not obvious from the outside, and what one first found inside did not necessarily represent the full story. That lesson became the seed of every later search. There is something almost comical, in a dry historical way, about how often human beings approach ancient monuments with complete confidence that they know what will justify the effort. Treasure, usually, gold, scrolls, sacred books, direct explanations. Then the monument answers with engineering, ambiguity and silence. The first openings of the Great Pyramid are a perfect example. Men cut their way in with dreams of what stone must be hiding, only to encounter a building much stranger than a simple treasure vault. A building whose hiddenness was structural, spatial and conceptual all at once. And perhaps that is the real gift of those early intrusions, even if the methods themselves were rough. They forced the world to confront the pyramid as an interior reality. Not just a wonder to be seen from outside, but a place with roots and chambers and controlled space. The act of breaking in accidentally revealed the monument's intelligence. From that point forward, the Great Pyramid could no longer be treated as only an exterior marvel. It had become a problem of internal design. The first openings made later discoveries possible in the broadest sense because they trained attention inward. They shifted the centre of the mystery from surface to structure. And once that happened, every corridor mattered, every chamber mattered, every blocked or little seen space mattered, especially the ones above the obvious rooms, where the builders had hidden not treasure, but something in some ways more important, evidence of how they kept a granite chamber alive under all that crushing stone, and traces in red paint that would later become some of the most discussed markings in the whole pyramid. Once people had forced their way into the Great Pyramid and begun moving through its passages, one room quickly took command of the imagination. It was not the lowest chamber cut into the bedrock, and it was not the middle chamber that later visitors would call the Queen's Chamber. It was the upper granite room now known as the King's Chamber, reached through the Grand Gallery, set deep within the body of the monument, and built in a way that still makes the whole interior feel more deliberate the longer you look at it. Britannica describes it as a chamber lined and roofed entirely with granite, and that detail alone changes the mood. Limestone is the pyramid's great mass, but here, at a crucial interior point, the builders turned to hard red granite and made a room that feels less like a hollow in stone and more like a statement placed inside it. The King's Chamber is not enormous in the way people often imagine before seeing its measurements. It is carefully proportioned rather than theatrically vast. The chamber is about 20 royal cubits long, 10 royal cubits wide, and roughly 5.8 metres high, with a flat ceiling formed by massive granite beams. The walls are made of precisely fitted granite blocks, and unlike the richly decorated burial spaces of later Egypt, the surfaces here are plain and uninscribed. That plainness matters. It is one of the quiet discoveries people make when they begin to think seriously about this room. The chamber does not overwhelm with imagery. It does not narrate itself on the walls. It offers shape, material, mass, and control. That restraint is one reason the room has never stopped generating questions. Inside the chamber sits the granite coffer, often casually called a sarcophagus, though even that familiar label can make the room seem more settled than it really is. Britannica notes that Khufu's sarcophagus rests in the King's Chamber, and National Geographic similarly presents the room as the place that held the King's stone box. But the emotional force of that coffer has always come from what is not with it. There is no complete burial lying there now, no glittering equipment still arranged around it, no crowded wall program telling later ages how to read the room. The coffer remains, and the room remains, and together they create a curious effect. Instead of closure, they produce a controlled kind of silence. That silence is part of why the spaces above the room became so important. If the King's Chamber alone had been all there was to know, the monument would still be extraordinary, but the story would feel cleaner. It does not feel clean. Above the flat granite ceiling are 5 narrow compartments, usually called the relieving chambers. Britannica describes them as empty rooms for reducing pressure above the King's Chamber, and other summaries of the pyramid explain that the likely purpose of the massive slabs was to shield the burial chamber ceiling by diverting the crushing force of masonry above. In plain terms, the builders appear to have created a hidden architectural buffer over one of the most important rooms in the pyramid. It is difficult to overstate how impressive that is. Hidden space here was not decoration. Hidden space was structural intelligence. This is where the Great Pyramid begins to look less like a sealed box and more like a machine for managing weight. The King's Chamber lies under an enormous burden of stone. A simpler builder might have put a room there and hoped the roof held. The actual builders did something more thoughtful. They stacked massive granite elements above the chamber and created a sequence of narrow cavities, with the uppermost capped by a pointed limestone roof. The result is not a set of ceremonial chambers in the ordinary sense. Nobody was meant to gather there. Nobody was meant to admire them as decorated spaces. Their job was to help the monument survive itself. The hidden chambers above the King's Chamber were, in the most literal way, part of how the pyramid kept one precious room from being crushed by its own greatness. Even the texture of those upper spaces tells a story. Accounts of the relieving compartments note that the granite blocks dividing them have flatter undersides and rougher upper surfaces, creating irregular floors in several of the spaces while preserving the needed structural surfaces. This is not fine ceremonial finish work hidden for some sacred mystery. It is practical interior work, tucked away where only builders would know it. That contrast is one of the most revealing things in the whole pyramid. Below, the King's Chamber presents controlled geometry and finished granite. Above, the hidden spaces look more like the backside of a task completed under pressure, where what mattered was function. It is a little like opening the wall behind a grand stage and finding the braces that made the performance possible. The first of those upper spaces to become known to later explorers is now called Davison's Chamber. Nathaniel Davison, an English traveller and diplomat, is credited with discovering it in the 1760s after following an unusual echo and crawling through a foul, cramped passage above the Grand Gallery. Later accounts describe that chamber as the lowest of the series above the king's chamber, accessible through an ancient passage rather than through blasting from above. This first discovery mattered because it changed the internal map of the pyramid. Suddenly, the flat granite ceiling of the king's chamber was no longer the final architectural layer. There was something over it, a concealed void with a purpose. That realization opened an entirely new line of thought. If one hidden space existed above the chamber, perhaps the pyramid still held others nearby. Davison's find did not settle the matter. It only sharpened it. Decades later, in 1837, Richard William Howard Vyse forced his way upward from that lower space and reached 4 additional chambers above it using boring rods and gunpowder. These upper compartments later acquired names such as Wellington's Chamber, Nelson's Chamber, Lady Arbuthnot's Chamber, and Campbell's Chamber. The methods were rough, and modern conservation-minded people naturally wince at the idea of blowing one's way through a world wonder. But the discovery itself was enormous. What had seemed to be one odd hidden cavity turned out to be part of a larger vertical system. The king's chamber was not simply covered by a single roof. It was protected by a layered structural arrangement concealed inside the pyramid. At this point, the story becomes especially interesting, because the most important discoveries in those spaces were not jewels or sacred books. They were marks. Red, ochre quarry marks and work gang inscriptions appeared on the blocks in the upper relieving chambers, especially in the 4 spaces reached by Vyse. These were not carved formal texts polished for display. They were more like practical markings left by the builders, the kind of writing one expects on a work site rather than in a finished ritual chamber. Some of the inscriptions include gang names connected to Khufu, and that is why they have played such an outsized role in debates about the pyramid. In a monument whose finished main chambers are notably bare, hidden construction spaces preserved some of the clearest traces of the people who actually raised it. There is something almost touching about that. The grand room below has no decorative speech to offer the visitor. The hidden spaces above it do. Not polished royal speeches, but worksite language, team names, red marks, signs left in places no tourist procession was ever meant to admire. The upper chambers preserve, in a strangely accidental way, the human side of the monument. One reason scholars have taken those marks seriously is that some were painted before the blocks were set into place. In the commonly cited descriptions, parts of the inscriptions are sideways, upside down, or partly covered by adjoining stones, which strongly suggests they were marked on the blocks during construction, rather than painted neatly afterward for effect. Hidden chambers, in other words, preserved hidden labour. That point matters because the Great Pyramid has attracted centuries of fantasy about who built it and how. A monument of this scale almost invites people to imagine lost super-civilizations, magic machines, or help from beings who never bother to leave payroll records. The red ochre marks do not answer every question about logistics or planning, but they pull the structure back toward the reality of organised human work. Even when the exact interpretation of every sign is debated, the broader picture is powerful. These upper spaces look like concealed structural compartments, and within them appear marks associated with work crews and with Khufu's name. The hidden spaces above the king's chamber therefore became some of the most important evidence in the whole pyramid for connecting the monument to the reign traditionally associated with it. It is also worth noticing how odd the route to that knowledge was. The king's chamber itself is a famous room. The evidence above it is hidden in cramped, irregular compartments no grand visitor was ever supposed to celebrate. That contrast is very Egyptian in one sense and very human in another. The polished room carries the kingly idea. The hidden structural spaces carry the fingerprints of process. If you only look at the main chamber, you see the finished face of the monument. If you look above it, you begin to see the backstage. Together they make a fuller picture. The pyramid was at once a royal statement, a burial environment, and an extraordinary feat of planning under pressure. You can feel all three more clearly when you think about the chamber and the spaces over it as one connected design. There is another quiet discovery around the King's Chamber that keeps the room from ever settling into a single explanation. Two narrow shafts run from the chamber obliquely through the masonry to the outside of the pyramid. Britannica notes that their purpose remains uncertain, whether ventilation, ritual function, or something more symbolic. This is one of those features that sounds simple until you sit with it. A granite chamber tucked deep inside the monument was given two carefully directed narrow channels leading out through the body of the pyramid. That is not an accidental detail. It tells us that the chamber was conceived not as a dead pocket of enclosed mass, but as a place linked, however narrowly, to the larger body of the structure and perhaps beyond it. The more closely one looks, the more the chamber seems balanced between practical and meaningful decisions. The granite construction is practical in the sense that granite is strong and prestigious. The upper relieving spaces are practical in the sense that they address load. The shafts may have had physical effects, but they may also have been bound to religious ideas. The plain walls are practical in their restraint, yet that very restraint changes the room's emotional power. It is dangerous to force a single label onto a place like this. The King's Chamber is not merely an empty box, and the spaces above it are not merely dead air. The entire ensemble is an arranged interior problem solved with care. That is what later explorers really found there. Not treasure, but planning. Even the cracks in the granite beams have become part of the conversation. Descriptions of the chamber note that the roof slabs show cracking and slight settlement. A reminder that this was never a casual undertaking. The builders were dealing with staggering loads and with the long future of the monument at the same time. The relieving spaces above the chamber may not have made the room invulnerable in any absolute sense, but they show a clear attempt to anticipate danger and manage it. There is something deeply impressive about that. The hidden chambers were not just spare compartments. They were part of an argument with gravity, and the fact that the room still exists after roughly 4.5 millennia suggests the builders were arguing from a position of unusual competence. This is one reason the area above and around the King's Chamber carries so much weight in the modern imagination. It does not produce the sort of cinematic discovery many people expect from a hidden chamber story. There was no glittering untouched treasury waiting over the granite ceiling. Instead, there was a structural solution, cramped concealed spaces, and red work marks. Yet those findings are, in a serious sense, more valuable than a pile of portable wealth would have been. Gold can be stolen and melted. A hidden structural system tells you how the builders thought. A painted gang name tells you something about the people who moved the stone. A rough upper compartment above a finished royal chamber tells you where beauty ended and labour began. Those are quiet discoveries, but they speak for a very long time. There is also a lesson here about how mystery really works in the Great Pyramid. The popular imagination often assumes that hidden means dramatic and ceremonial, as though every concealed space must exist to guard a sacred object. The chambers above the King's Chamber suggest a different pattern. Some hiddenness exists because architecture needs privacy from the eye. A support system does not need an audience. The spaces were important precisely because nobody needed to stand in them once the job was done. They were buried in the monument and allowed to disappear into function. That makes their later rediscovery all the more intimate. To enter them is to step into an area the finished building had already forgotten how to display. And yet, because the pyramid is the pyramid, even these practical upper spaces refuse to stay merely practical in the imagination. The marks above the chamber helped anchor the monument to Khufu. The structural design above the granite roof sharpened respect for ancient engineering. The hiddenness of the compartments encouraged further suspicion that other concealed areas might still exist elsewhere in the monument. In that sense, the King's Chamber and its upper spaces performed two opposite functions at once. They explained a little and provoked even more. They showed that the pyramid's secrets were real, but not always in the way treasure hunters hoped. Hidden chambers could preserve architecture, evidence, and silence together. So when people ask what was found above and around the king's chamber, the honest answer is richer than it first sounds. A granite room was found, plain and controlled, with its stone coffer still there. 5 concealed compartments were found above it, engineered to manage the weight of the pyramid. Workgang marks in red ochre were found in those upper spaces, some tied to Khufu's name. Narrow shafts were found leaving the chamber through the masonry. And in the broadest sense, something else was found too. Proof that the Great Pyramid's hidden interior was not random, not simple, and not exhausted by the first room one reached. Once you understand that, it becomes much easier to see why the next great puzzle inside the monument would gather around another chamber whose name sounds familiar, whose meaning remains slippery, and whose narrow channels would eventually lead modern searchers towards small blocking stones, tiny doors in the dark, and a new phase of wandering inside the stone. The moment people first realised that the Great Pyramid had hidden spaces above the king's chamber, the room below changed character. It was no longer simply a granite chamber sitting inside a mountain of stone. It was a chamber with a concealed world over its ceiling, a set of narrow structural compartments no ceremony was ever meant to celebrate. Nathaniel Davison found the first of these spaces in the 18th century, and then Richard William Howard Vyse forced his way upward in 1837 into 4 more chambers that had been completely inaccessible since construction. Those upper 4 spaces turned out to contain what looked, at first glance, like almost nothing worth bragging about. Rough stone surfaces and red-painted marks on the blocks. No gold, no perfect royal speech, no theatrical revelation waiting for a torch beam. Just red signs high above the most famous room in the pyramid. And yet those marks would become some of the most important words ever found inside the monument, because they were not ornamental at all. They were practical, tucked away in hidden structural chambers above the granite roof, and they appeared in places no ordinary ancient visitor was meant to inspect. That is part of what makes them so striking. The Great Pyramid is famously restrained inside. Britannica notes that the king's chamber is lined and roofed with granite, while the wider pyramid contains very little open space and very little in the way of displayed interior text. Later summaries of the monument point out that one of the first notable discoveries of the 19th century was labourers' graffiti indicating the pyramid belonged to Khufu. In other words, the main rooms that later generations obsess over are not lavishly talking rooms. They do not behave like later decorated tomb interiors. The red marks above the king's chamber therefore matter partly because they sit in exactly the wrong place for modern expectation. Hidden over the ceiling in cramped relieving spaces whose job was probably to divert weight. They preserve bits of the work site rather than the public face of the monument. These were not messages for pilgrims or poetry for the dead. They were the sort of rough, direct markings people make while building something immense and trying to keep order in the process. That is why they feel so intimate. They survive where polish stops and labour begins. Once scholars began studying them more carefully, the marks started to look less like random paint and more like the language of organised crews. Harvard Magazine, summarising work on pyramid builder graffiti more broadly, notes that workers in the Old Kingdom were organised into labour units with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkar, while the Smithsonian similarly explains that quarry workers' marks on stone blocks can preserve gang names. The red graffiti above the king's chamber fit that wider pattern. In standard summaries of the Great Pyramid inscriptions, the names recorded in the upper chambers include work gang designations connected to Khufu, such as Khufu excites love and the white crown of Khnum Khufu is powerful, along with formulas using Khufu's Horus name Medjedu. That sounds almost cheerful by the standards of a giant tomb, and perhaps that is one reason the marks stay in the mind. They do not sound like grim, silent labour. They sound like named teams at work, the kind of crews that carry identity with them and leave labels where labels help. Once that possibility settles in, the hidden spaces above the chamber stop feeling empty. They begin to feel occupied, if only by traces of organisation, motion, and voices long gone. The physical behaviour of the marks is one of the strongest reasons mainstream Egyptology treats them seriously. They do not appear to have been painted neatly onto a finished room for later admiration. Standard descriptions note that some inscriptions are sideways, upside down, or partly covered by adjoining stones, which indicates that blocks were marked before they were set into place. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes everything. A neat fake is something one paints onto a visible surface. A work mark partly disappearing behind another block is something one expects in construction. A sign turned the wrong way is not necessarily wrong at all if the stone was marked in the yard or quarry and then lifted into a hidden structural cavity where no later audience was expected. The very awkwardness of these markings helps them. They do not read like a staged announcement. They read like a building process frozen in the act. And because the chambers themselves were sealed and structurally buried high above the king's chamber, the marks remained tucked away in a place where display would have made very little sense. Hidden chambers preserved hidden procedure. That is why the red ochre signs loom so large in debates over who built the Great Pyramid. Britannica's archaeology section explicitly notes that one of the first notable discoveries in the 1830s was labourers' graffiti indicating that the pyramid belonged to Khufu. More detailed summaries of the relieving chambers add that Khufu's name appears repeatedly there in more than one royal form, including his birth name Khnum Khufu and his Horus name Medjiddu. The importance of that should not be exaggerated into a magic key that solves every question about the monument, but neither should it be shrugged off. The main finished chambers are famously sparse in overt textual clues. These hidden red marks therefore became some of the most direct internal traces linking the monument to Khufu's reign. They are not glamorous evidence, they do not shimmer, they do not fit the movie version of archaeology, but they are exactly the sort of evidence historians often trust most. Small, practical traces that were not made to impress us, and therefore often tell the truth more quietly than grand inscriptions do. There is also something deeply human in the medium itself. Red paint is not stone carving. It is faster, more provisional, more workmanlike. It suggests movement, instruction, assignment, counting, ownership, sequence, and the ordinary need to label things while a huge operation is underway. The hidden relieving spaces above the king's chamber were likely there to shield the granite roof from the crushing force of the masonry above, not to host religious display. Britannica describes those 5 compartments as pressure-relieving spaces whose likely purpose was to divert the immense thrust above the burial chamber. Once that is kept in mind, the graffiti become even more revealing. These were not ceremonial texts placed in a royal showpiece. They were signs left in the building's bones. The glamorous room below and the rough-marked chambers above belong to the same monument, but to different moods of creation. Below is the finished royal statement. Above is the engineering and labour that made the statement possible. The red marks sit right on that boundary, and perhaps that is why they feel so valuable. They are not the voice of the monument pretending to be eternal. They are the murmur of the crew while the job was still happening. The marks also changed the emotional history of the pyramid itself. Before their discovery, people could imagine the monument however they pleased. They could picture lost libraries, impossible knowledge, hidden treasure, or some forgotten civilization too advanced for ordinary explanation. After the discovery of the work gang names and similar practical signs, that fantasy did not disappear, but it had to share the room with evidence of actual labour organisation. Harvard's summary of pyramid graffiti elsewhere shows that named teams and labour divisions were not unusual in Old Kingdom construction culture, and the Smithsonian notes that worker marks survive on stone blocks from Egyptian pyramid building contexts more generally. The red ochre above the king's chamber fits that world rather than replacing it with something supernatural. This does not make the pyramid less extraordinary, it makes it more grounded. It says that wonder can come from competence, coordination, and scale, rather than from imported mystery. Millions of stones, hidden structural spaces, carefully managed loads, and teams confident enough to leave their names in red paint inside the monument's concealed architecture. That is already more than enough to keep a person awake longer than they meant to be. Recent work has added another interesting layer. Summaries of the 2024 high-resolution survey of the relieving chambers report that previously unknown graffiti were documented, including a partial date formula on the west wall of Nelson's chamber, reading year of the 6th census, 2nd month of the prey season, day, along with a mention of the goddess Wadjet that may have belonged to a gang name. Those reports also note levelling lines and mason's indication marks in the relieving spaces. Even with the usual caution that comes with fresh epigraphic work, the pattern is clear enough to be exciting. The red signs above the King's Chamber were not exhausted in the 19th century. Better imaging and closer inspection are still recovering material from those cramped hidden spaces. That is an extraordinary thought. A monument discussed for centuries can still yield additional traces of the people who built it, not because a golden chamber suddenly swung open, but because someone took the time to look more carefully at faded paint where very few people can comfortably stand. The Great Pyramid remains stubbornly modern in that way. It keeps rewarding patient attention instead of theatrical force. Because the marks are so important, they have naturally attracted dispute. Some fringe writers have argued that Weiss forged parts of the graffiti in 1837, largely because the inscriptions matter so much for linking the monument to Khufu. That claim exists and should be acknowledged as part of the modern afterlife of the pyramid. At the same time, mainstream reference works and Egyptological summaries continue to treat the red graffiti as ancient labour marks, and recent documentation has reported additional markings rather than collapsing the case for their antiquity. Britannica still summarises the 19th century labourers' graffiti as evidence indicating the pyramid belonged to Khufu, and current discussions of the relieving chambers continue to cite the pre-placement character of the marks, the gang names, and the newly observed traces in those spaces. In practical terms, the scholarly centre of gravity has not moved to forgery. It remains with the view that these are genuine construction-era markings preserved in hidden structural cavities. The controversy therefore tells us more about the cultural burden placed on the pyramid than about the chambers themselves. The more a monument matters, the more every small trace inside it becomes a battlefield for larger stories people want to tell. Still, even if one sets aside the arguments and returns to the chambers themselves, the basic lesson remains simple and powerful. The red ochre marks were never meant for us, and that is exactly why they matter. They were hidden over a ceiling, inside structural spaces, above a chamber that later ages turned into a symbol. They were left by people doing a job so large that later centuries almost could not believe it had been done by organised human labour at all. Those people labelled blocks, named gangs, drew lines, marked assignments, and then disappeared into the monument they were helping raise. The polished surfaces and giant forms lasted. Their quick red handwriting lasted too, though only in places where the finished building had no reason to show it off. There is something very fitting about that. In a monument famous for silence, some of the most useful words survived when nobody was supposed to see them. They survived because the pyramid hid them from admiration, and perhaps that is the calmest way to understand their importance. The quarry graffiti above the King's Chamber do not solve every mystery of the Great Pyramid. They do not tell us every logistical detail, every ritual meaning, or every internal decision. What they do is more modest, and, for that reason, more convincing. They tell us that named crews were there. They tell us that Khufu's royal identity was present in the working language of construction. They tell us that the blocks were marked before final placement. They tell us that hidden spaces can preserve history more honestly than famous rooms do. Once a person absorbs that lesson, it becomes harder to look at any other chamber in the pyramid in a lazy way. The monument starts teaching a new habit. Pay attention to the least glamorous detail, because that is often where the real evidence lives. And with that habit in place, the eye naturally begins to drift away from the granite chamber and its hidden ceiling spaces toward another room, deeper in the public imagination and much less settled in purpose. A room with its own shafts, its own strange niche, and its own long record of refusing to explain itself too quickly. The room people call the Queen's Chamber is one of those places where a familiar name quietly gets in the way. Britannica bluntly calls the label a misnomer, and that matters more than it first seems. The name makes the room sound settled, as if historians know exactly who it was for and exactly what it was meant to do. In reality, the chamber's old nickname has survived much better than certainty has. It lies inside the Great Pyramid on the route up from the lower passages, but it is not the burial room usually identified with Khufu, and it does not come with an ancient sign on the wall explaining its role. From the start, then, the room invites a particular kind of misunderstanding. People hear Queen's Chamber and imagine a clear answer. The actual chamber offers the opposite, a room that has been seen for centuries and still does not explain itself cleanly. Physically, the chamber is not grand in the way the pyramid's exterior is grand. It is smaller, quieter, made of fine limestone rather than granite, and capped with a pointed or gabled roof that gives it a very particular shape. It sits at the end of the horizontal passage branching from the ascending route, tucked into the body of the pyramid rather than placed at its most theatrically impressive point. Ancient Egypt Online notes that the walls are bare and that the chamber has no inscriptions, while Britannica's broader descriptions of the interior emphasize how little open space the Great Pyramid contains overall. In other words, this is not a hall full of spectacle. It is a compact, controlled room inside a monument already famous for giving the public much less interior drama than popular imagination expects. That simplicity is one reason the chamber stays in the mind. The room looks deliberate but not self-explanatory. It feels important, but it does not tell you in plain language why. One feature dominates the room immediately, the niche in the east wall. It rises high, has its own corbelled form, and looks exactly like the sort of thing that ought to come with a label in the ancient plan. Instead, it comes with arguments. Ancient Egypt Online describes it as a large recess reaching high up the wall, and notes that the usual suggestion, a statue of the king or his car once standing there, remains speculation. Other popular summaries of the room make the same basic point. The niche is too prominent to ignore, but not clear enough to settle the chamber's purpose. It is a physical fact that produces interpretive trouble. If the room had no niche at all, one set of theories would weaken. Because it does have one, those theories cannot be dismissed. Yet no surviving statue, fitting inscription, or fixed installation closes the case. The niche behaves like the chamber itself, present, deliberate, and strangely unhelpful. That is why the chamber has spent so long sitting between explanations. Some have seen it as an earlier burial chamber later superseded by the king's chamber higher up. Others have treated it as a symbolic room rather than a practical burial space. The niches encourage comparisons with places meant to host a statue, a false door, or some kind of cultic focus. But none of these ideas has won in a way that ends the discussion. What makes the room so stubborn is that several possibilities remain just plausible enough to survive. It is bare but clearly intentional. It is central enough to matter, but not furnished in a way that fixes its role. Even the fact that Britannica calls the name a misnomer works like a warning. The chamber entered history under a title that sounds secure, yet much of the real conversation begins once you stop trusting the title. If the niche gives the room one mystery, the shafts give it another, and in some ways a bigger one. In 1872, British engineer Wayneman Dixon investigated the chamber and discovered openings in the north and south walls that led into narrow shafts. According to standard summaries of the Great Pyramid, these were similar in general idea to the shafts from the King's Chamber, but they did not simply present themselves to earlier observers as obvious open channels. Dixon's work led to the recovery of 3 small objects now famous as the Dixon relics: a stone ball, a copper hook, and a piece of cedar wood. Smithsonian reports that the objects were taken from the Queen's Chamber area during Dixon's investigation, and later summaries of the pyramid note that the shafts themselves were one of the room's most important hidden features. It is hard to overstate how much those finds changed the chamber's mood. A bare limestone room is one thing. A bare limestone room with secret shafts in its walls is something else entirely. The Dixon relics are modest objects, which is part of why they are so intriguing. A copper hook, a stone ball, fragments of cedar wood. These are not treasures in the dramatic sense, but they are precisely the kind of small finds that make a sealed feature feel historical rather than theoretical. They suggest use, process, or construction in some form, even if they do not provide a clean explanation by themselves. The wood turned out to be especially interesting. Smithsonian reported in 2020 that the long-lost cedar fragments, rediscovered in Aberdeen, were radiocarbon dated to between 3,341 and 3,094 BC, centuries earlier than the usual historical date for Khufu's pyramid. The same report notes sensible explanations for this, including the age of the wood itself, the reuse of older material, or long preservation before use. So the date did not overturn pyramid history, but it did make a small forgotten relic suddenly feel complicated again. The Queen's Chamber has a habit of doing that. Even the tiniest object connected to it manages to produce more questions than closure. The shafts themselves are where the chamber's mystery truly hardens. The Great Pyramid has 4 such narrow channels in total, 2 associated with the King's Chamber and 2 with the Queen's Chamber. But the 2 sets do not behave identically. Standard descriptions of the interior note that the King's Chamber shafts run obliquely through the masonry to the exterior of the pyramid, while the Queen's Chamber shafts do not continue all the way to the outer face, and their purpose remains unknown. That difference has mattered for every theory ever proposed about the room. If the Queen's Chamber shafts were only for ventilation, why do they terminate internally? If they were symbolic rather than practical, why build them with such care at all? If the chamber was abandoned at some stage, why were the shafts there in the first place? No single answer silences the others. The room keeps looking as if it belongs to a plan, but a plan whose logic is only partly visible from where we stand. The dimensions of the shafts help explain why they became a modern puzzle rather than an ordinary archaeological corridor. These are not passageways for people. The University of Leeds describes the shaft investigated by the JD team as roughly 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres and around 60 metres long, a tiny engineered route running through the body of the pyramid where no human could simply crawl and see what lay ahead. Archaeology magazine likewise described the relevant shaft as about 8 inches square and more than 200 feet long. Those measurements changed the whole emotional picture. The shafts are too deliberate to dismiss and too small to explore in the old-fashioned way. They belong to the pyramid's design, but they deny ordinary access. That combination is almost perfectly calibrated to provoke curiosity. A person can stand in the Queen's Chamber, look at the little opening in the wall, and know that something extends out there through the stone, then stops being knowable without machines. Ancient builders created a mystery that had to wait for robotics. In 1993, that waiting produced one of the most famous moments in the history of pyramid exploration. Rudolf Gantenbrink's robot Upuaut 2 was sent into the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber and reached a limestone blocking stone fitted with 2 copper handles or loops. The discovery quickly became famous because it looked, to almost everyone, like a small door set at the end of a hidden route. The same campaign struggled with the northern shaft because of its more awkward course. Whether one prefers to call the blocking slab a door, a sealed block, or something more neutral, the basic effect was the same. The Queen's Chamber stopped being merely a room with shafts and became a room whose shafts ended in fitted closures. Once that happened, the chamber's uncertainty became much more focused. It was no longer just a matter of what was this room for, but also, why would roots this precise end in blocking stones inside the pyramid at all? That discovery did not stay frozen in the 1990s. In 2002, a National Geographic-supported robot drilled a tiny hole through the blocking stone in the southern shaft and sent a camera through, finding that another stone slab stood behind it. Later work pushed the mystery further. Archaeology magazine reported in 2011 that a robot carrying a flexible camera travelled through the northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber until it too reached a limestone door. Through a small hole, the camera recorded copper pins with curved heads and painted markings described as hieroglyphic numbers in the space between that block and another limestone barrier beyond it. The University of Leeds later summarised the same phase of robotic exploration by noting that the camera also revealed a second blocking stone and coloured markings on the floor of a tiny hidden chamber, while what lay beyond the second stone remained unanswered. This is a wonderfully Great Pyramid result. The robot reaches the hidden end of a shaft, peeks through, and finds not a final answer but another barrier and more clues. The chamber does not open into certainty. It opens into a smaller mystery. This is also the point where popular imagination often outruns evidence, and the Queen's Chamber has suffered from that for a very long time. Because the room has a niche, because it has two mysterious shafts, because those shafts end in blocking stones, people constantly try to force a single dramatic interpretation onto it. It must be a symbolic womb room, some say, or an abandoned original burial chamber, or a sealed ritual chamber, or a hidden message in architecture. The safer position, and honestly the more interesting one, is that the evidence gives us a set of facts but not yet a final synthesis. The room is real, carefully built, undecorated, and fitted with a prominent niche. It has two narrow shafts that terminate internally. Robotic exploration has shown blocking stones, copper fittings, and markings in tiny spaces beyond. But the precise functional meaning of all this remains unsettled. The chamber refuses to be simplified, and that refusal is exactly what keeps it alive in the literature and in the imagination. There is a practical side to the mystery that people sometimes miss. A room can be puzzling not because it's supernatural, but because it belongs to a design process more complex than our categories. Modern people often want to sort ancient rooms cleanly. Tomb, temple, storeroom, ventilation feature, symbolic chamber, construction remnant. The Queen's Chamber seems to resist that style of labelling. Its limestone finish and roof line suggest care. Its niche suggests that the east wall mattered for some reason. Its shaft suggests connection to the wider body of the pyramid. Their internal termination suggests that whatever role they played was not the same as the function of the King's Chamber shafts. The room therefore sits in a zone where architecture, ritual logic, and changing design decisions may all overlap. That does not make it vague. It makes it difficult. And difficult monuments often survive in the public mind better than ones that explain themselves too quickly. Even the chamber's emotional effect contributes to its reputation. The King's Chamber, with its granite and its coffer, has the prestige of the obvious royal space. The Queen's Chamber has something more unsettling. It looks finished enough that it should make sense, but sparse enough that it does not. The niche feels purposeful, but unread. The little shaft openings suggest routes that the body cannot follow. The room is not visually noisy. It is controlled, still, almost severe. That austerity pushes the mind toward function. Yet the more one asks about function, the less satisfying the easy answers become. It is not hard to see why the room has acted like a magnet for both serious scholarship and excited speculation. The chamber seems built to trigger one very human response. Surely this must mean something specific. Then it declines to tell you what. The rediscovered cedar fragment adds a particularly strange little footnote to all this. Smithsonian noted that the wood from the Queen's Chamber area may have been part of a larger piece still seen in robotic exploration of the shaft. That means the room does not just preserve mystery in the abstract, it preserves partial histories of interaction. 19th century investigators found 3 objects, removed some of them, lost track of one, and left modern researchers with an awkward combination of old discovery and new technology. The Queen's Chamber has therefore become a place where different centuries of inquiry overlap. Dixon could open the wall and retrieve relics, but not travel the shaft. Modern robots can travel the shaft and film what lies farther in, but they do so with much greater caution and far less appetite for smashing through the monument. The room now carries both histories at once, the age of force and the age of careful peering. That overlap is probably the best way to understand why the Queen's Chamber still matters so much. It is not simply one more room on the tourist route, nor merely a prelude to the better-known granite chamber above. It is the place where the Great Pyramid's internal mystery becomes unmistakably layered. There is the visible room, there is the niche in the wall, there are the hidden shafts, there are the relics recovered from them, there are the blocking stones at their ends, there are the markings glimpsed beyond. Every stage of investigation has added a feature without fully settling the room's role. That is not failure. It is the real shape of the evidence. Some ancient spaces do not give up their meaning in one discovery because their meaning was woven through design, use, and symbolism all at once. The Queen's Chamber may be one of those spaces, so when people ask what the Queen's Chamber is, the most honest answer is also the least flashy. It is a limestone chamber inside the Great Pyramid, wrongly named by later tradition, marked by a tall east wall niche and two narrow shafts whose purpose is still debated. It yielded the Dixon relics in the 19th century. Its shafts led modern robots to blocking stones, copper fittings, and painted markings in spaces no human body can simply enter. And after all that, it still does not resolve into a single function that everyone accepts. That is why the room matters. It is not the chamber that solves the pyramid. It is the chamber that teaches you the pyramid may not be solvable in the tidy way people hope. Once that lesson settles in, the eye naturally moves away from the room itself and toward those little fitted barriers waiting in the dark at the ends of its shafts, because the next stage of the story is not really about the chamber anymore. It is about the doors hidden inside the stone and what exactly the builders thought should stay behind them. The word door does a lot of work in this story, and some of it is slightly misleading. When people hear that explorers found doors deep inside the Great Pyramid's shafts, they tend to picture little hinged panels, maybe something that swings open onto a hidden chamber, if only someone can find the right ancient trick. What was actually found was stranger and more restrained than that. Deep inside the narrow shafts leading from the so-called Queen's Chamber, robots encountered carefully fitted limestone blocking stones. They looked door-like, because they closed the shafts neatly, and because the first one discovered had two copper fittings on its face. But these were not tiny household doors in the ordinary sense. They were stone barriers set into a route so tight that no human being could crawl through it. The mystery comes not from theatrical design, but from how deliberate the barriers seem once you realise where they were placed and how hard they were to reach. To understand why those blocking stones caused such a stir, it helps to remember the scale of the shafts themselves. According to the University of Leeds, the passage explored by the JD robot was about 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres and roughly 60 metres long. The Journal of Field Robotics describes the southern shaft as beginning with a short horizontal stretch and then climbing at about a 40-degree angle through the masonry. This was not a crawl space built for people. It was a line drawn through stone, narrow enough to exclude the body and long enough to feel almost unreasonable. Once you understand that, the discovery of a fitted barrier at the far end stops sounding like a fun curiosity and starts sounding like a real architectural choice. Someone built a very narrow internal route and then deliberately stopped it with a carefully made stone. The shafts from the Queen's Chamber had already been hidden once before modern robotics ever entered the story. Ancient Egypt Online notes that they were originally bricked up and not rediscovered until 1872, when Wayman Dixon investigated the chamber. That means these passages were concealed not only by their size and inaccessibility, but even at their opening points inside the chamber itself. This matters because it tells us that the later mystery did not begin at the far end with the blocking stones. It began at the room, where the very existence of the shafts had to be discovered. By the time robots were sent into them in the late 20th century, the shafts already had the feel of something half hidden by design. The blocking stones were not the first secret, only the deepest one then visible. The first major modern encounter with one of these barriers came in 1993, when German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent his robot Upuart 2 into the southern shaft of the Queen's chamber. The Journal of Field Robotics summarises the earlier mission by noting that Upuart 2 reached about 63.5 metres into the shaft before encountering a stone built across it to terminate the passage. That stone became known as the first blocking stone and carried 2 centrally mounted copper fittings of unknown purpose. Ancient Egypt Online similarly describes the barrier as a small Tura limestone slab with 2 heavily corroded copper pieces inserted into it. The immediate effect was electric. A route that nobody could traverse in person had ended not in a rough dead stop, but in a fitted stone face with metal features. Even without any wild theory attached to it, that was enough to transform a technical discovery into one of the most famous images in pyramid exploration. Part of the power of that moment came from what the blocking stone seemed to imply. If a shaft simply ended in unfinished rock, people could shrug and call it an abandoned construction line, or a symbolic feature that had gone only so far. A finished-looking barrier suggests intention much more strongly. It says the end of the shaft was treated as a place worth completing. It says someone cared about how the passage terminated. The copper fittings intensified that impression because they looked like handles, even if nobody knew what they actually did. It is easy to see why the public imagination leaped ahead. A hidden shaft inside the Great Pyramid ends at a small stone slab with metal loops. That sounds exactly like the kind of thing that should conceal something beyond it. The problem, as usual with the Great Pyramid, is that sounding meaningful and being simply interpretable are not the same thing. Gantenbrink's robot also highlighted an important asymmetry between the 2 Queen's chamber shafts. The northern shaft was more difficult because of bends in its course. Ancient Egypt Online notes that the north shaft turns after about 17 metres, likely to curve around the Grand Gallery, and Gantenbrink did not complete that route in 1993. So for a time, one little stone barrier in the southern shaft became the centre of attention, and the northern shaft remained a problem waiting for another machine. This only sharpened the sense that the pyramid's hidden features were selective. One line gave up an image, the other withheld it. Even within the same chamber, the monument refused to reveal itself evenly. In 2002, a new robot was sent up the southern shaft in a televised exploration supported by National Geographic, and this time the barrier was approached more aggressively. Ancient Egypt Online reports that a miniature fibre optic camera was inserted through a drilled hole in the first blocking stone, revealing a rough blocking stone about 21 centimetres beyond it. Contemporary reporting also described the result as the discovery of another sealed stone slab behind the first one, so the famous little door didn't open onto a hidden treasure room or a grand empty chamber. It opened onto a tiny gap and then another stone. This is one of the most Great Pyramid outcomes imaginable. The first secret yields to inspection only long enough to reveal a second secret standing right behind it. That same 2002 phase also confirmed that the northern shaft had its own matching surprise. Ancient Egypt Online states that a robot built by iRobot later made it up the north shaft and found a similar door there as well, with the 2 doors equidistant from the Queen's chamber. That symmetry matters. A single blocking stone might be explained away as an odd local feature. A matched pair at comparable distances is much harder to dismiss. It suggests planning across both shafts rather than a random accident of construction. The pyramid was not merely terminating one shaft in a neat way, it was doing something comparable in both of them. That does not tell us why, but it strongly implies that the pattern itself mattered. Still, the word door continued to create problems. The more closely later teams examined the southern blocking stone, the less it behaved like an ordinary opening mechanism. The Jedi paper reports that the first blocking stone was about 60mm thick and sat in a carefully worked arrangement at the end of the shaft, with a small chamber about 190 to 200mm deep beyond it, before the second blocking stone. The researchers reconstructed the geometry and concluded that the first stone appears to have been slid down into place onto a ledge. They also reported no obvious evidence that it was mortared in on any side. This is fascinating because it makes the slab look very deliberate, but not in the sense of a convenient little panel designed for someone to open from the front. It behaves more like a placed barrier, a fitted closure. Calling it a door is still understandable, but calling it a blocking stone is more precise. The copper fittings became even more interesting under closer inspection. The JD team was able to look at the front and rear of the fittings and found that the metal pins curved back on themselves into small hoops. The paper notes that the loops were tiny, only large enough to let an object of about 3mm in diameter pass through, and that they did not seem well positioned for mechanical purposes because they sat high up on the block. The researchers also observed that the rear face of the first blocking stone was carefully worked and very flat. That combination is one of the great quiet shocks of the whole story. The famous handles were probably not practical handles in the common sense, and the back of the slab was not rough-hidden stone but a finished surface. The farther one gets from the first dramatic photograph, the more subtle and peculiar the feature becomes. This is where a calmer reading becomes more rewarding than a dramatic one. The copper loops are not especially convincing as lifting hardware. The slab does not read like a tiny hinged access hatch. The little chamber behind it is only a few hand widths deep before another blocking stone appears. Yet the finish of the rear face and the care of the arrangement strongly suggest that this was not a casual plug shoved in to stop rubble. The JD paper explicitly notes that the polished rear face and the carefully worked geometry raise more questions than answers. The University of Leeds summary says the robot found intricate coloured markings on the floor of the small hidden chamber and also revealed a second blocking stone that the team could not get beyond. In other words, the architecture behind the first barrier is not chaotic, it is arranged. That is exactly what keeps the mystery alive. Those markings behind the first stone are another reason the phrase "doors in the dark" feels right, even if door is technically imprecise. The JD team reported a red ochre mason's line running along the floor of the tiny chamber behind the first blocking stone toward the second one, with additional red ochre figures nearby and a black mark where the line meets the second stone. The Leeds account summarises these as intricate coloured markings on the floor of a small hidden chamber. This means the space between the two barriers was not just a meaningless void, it contained traces of planning or working marks. The tiny chamber had its own visual evidence inside it, so even after a robot crossed the first threshold, the story did not reduce to nothing there. There was something there, a very small, carefully made space, a second blocking stone, and markings that tie the cavity back to the building process or design logic of the pyramid itself. The emotional structure of the discovery is part of what made it so memorable. In ordinary archaeology, one expects a barrier to lead to a room and a room to lead to finds. Here the sequence is more controlled and almost mischievous. First there is the shaft, inaccessible to humans, then the first blocking stone, then a narrow hidden space, then another blocking stone. The architecture keeps distributing revelation in the smallest possible portions. This is the Great Pyramid at its most characteristic. It does not give a grand answer. It gives measured resistance. Every breakthrough turns out to be only enough to prove that another limit exists ahead. That resistance has encouraged all kinds of interpretation, some reasonable, some not. One modest possibility is that the blocking stones belong to a symbolic or ritual program rather than a purely practical one. Another is that they reflect a construction procedure whose meaning is not obvious from the finished monument. What the evidence does not support very well is the idea that these were merely sloppy ends to irrelevant passageways. The matched barriers, the copper loops, the worked faces, and the markings beyond the first slab all point toward intention. The difficulty is that intention is not the same thing as explanation. A pyramid can show you that something was carefully done without telling you why it was done. That is precisely what these blocking stones accomplish. There is also something strangely moving about the role of robots in this story. Human bodies were never going to crawl 60 metres up a 20-centimetre shaft. The barriers remained effectively unreachable until engineers built machines delicate enough to travel there without causing more harm. The Leeds team emphasised that their robot had to move gently and avoid damage, and the Journal of Field Robotics discusses previous missions leaving marks in the shaft walls that later designs tried to minimise. So the history of these doors is also a history of restraint. Earlier generations broke into pyramids with force. These later generations reached the most tantalising hidden barriers by becoming smaller, lighter, and more careful. The route into the mystery narrowed until only patient technology could fit, and that is probably the best way to hold the image in the mind before moving on. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, beyond the visible chambers and the passages tourists know, 2 narrow shafts rise out of the Queen's chamber. At the far ends of those shafts sit carefully fitted limestone blocking stones. The first one, reached in 1993, carried 2 copper fittings. In 2002, a drilled glimpse through it revealed a tiny chamber and a second stone beyond. Later robotic work showed that the first stone was carefully placed, that its copper fittings curved into little hoops on the back, and that the small hidden space behind it held red ochre markings on the floor. Nothing here behaves like a cheap adventure story, and that is why it lingers. The barriers are real, but their purpose remains unsettled. They do not swing open. They do not announce themselves. They simply remain there deep in the dark, proving that the inside of the pyramid was designed with a level of selectivity that still has not fully come clear, which is why the story naturally has to widen now from these tiny hidden thresholds to the stranger spaces below the main route, where the pyramid stops feeling like a sealed riddle in the upper stone and starts feeling like a place with older, rougher, more awkward cavities beneath the polished plan. By the time most people picture the inside of the Great Pyramid, they're already standing too high. Their minds go to the Grand Gallery, the so-called Queen's Chamber, the Granite King's Chamber, the little shafts, the hidden relieving spaces, and the neat drama of stone closing off stone. But the pyramid also has another mood entirely, one that begins by going down instead of up. Britannica's description of the interior is very plain about the route. From the entrance on the north side, a sloping corridor descends through the masonry, then into the rock beneath the monument, and ends in an unfinished underground chamber. That simple fact changes the feeling of the whole structure. The Great Pyramid is not only a mountain of built stone with chambers raised into its body. Part of it reaches into the bedrock below, where the spaces become rougher, darker, and less settled. The famous upper interior feels composed. The lower interior feels exposed, almost as though you're seeing an earlier thought the builders never fully cleaned up before moving on to a different solution. This is one of the reasons the lower spaces have always attracted such a strange mix of interest and neglect. They are not as visually famous as the upper chambers, and they do not lend themselves to tidy postcard mythology. There is no great granite box down there to focus the imagination. Instead, there is a long descent, a rock-cut chamber, a blind corridor, a pit in the floor, and a vertical shaft known as the well shaft that climbs back up toward the Grand Gallery by a winding and awkward route. If the upper spaces of the pyramid feel like a finished royal interior, the lower ones feel like architecture caught between intention and revision. Britannica states directly that the subterranean chambers were never completed, and Ancient Egypt Online similarly describes the underground chamber as unfinished, with protective blocking stones apparently never placed at its entrance. That unfinished quality matters because it makes the lower interior feel less like a final answer, and more like a surviving argument inside the monument. The descent itself is part of the experience. the downward corridor cuts through the body of the pyramid and then continues into the rock below. Britannica notes that the main descending corridor ends in an unfinished underground chamber, and Ancient Egypt Online adds that the corridor continues into the bedrock for about 30 metres under the base, before turning into a horizontal passage. This is not a decorative transition. It is a movement from engineered monument into the ground under the monument. The change in material and mood matters. Up above, the pyramid speaks in straight intention and finished geometry. Down here, the line between architecture and excavation becomes thinner. The monument is no longer simply built on the plateau, it invades it. That gives the lower spaces an almost older feeling, not because they are older in a simple chronological sense, but because they are tied to the raw problem of where a pyramid begins, not at its tip, not at its shining outer skin, but in the rock it stands on, and the voids cut into that rock. The subterranean chamber itself is the roughest of the three main chambers, and the only one cut directly into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. According to the detailed interior summary, it lies about 27 metres below base level and measures roughly 8.4 by 14.1 metres, with a height of about 4 metres. The western half of the room is unfinished, with quarry trenches still visible, and a niche was cut into the west wall. That combination is very revealing. This is not a polished final chamber abandoned in neat silence. It is visibly a work site, at least in part, a room that still shows the marks of extraction and incomplete shaping. The unfinished western side, the niche, and the chamber's low position beneath the whole structure have all contributed to one long-running view that this may have been an earlier intended burial chamber later superseded by higher rooms in the pyramid. Britannica does not push that theory on its own page, but it does emphasise that the subterranean chambers were never completed, which fits the larger sense that we are looking at a plan that changed before this level was brought to a finished state. That unfinished quality creates a very particular kind of mystery. It is not the mystery of a sealed room waiting behind a stone slab. It is the mystery of interruption. Why stop here? Why cut this much and no more? Why produce a chamber below ground in a pyramid whose most famous burial room ended up much higher, lined with granite and protected by hidden relieving spaces? Ancient Egypt Online notes that the entrance to the underground chamber appears too small to allow a sarcophagus to be carried into the room after completion, which is one reason many researchers hesitate to treat it as the final intended burial place, even though the descending corridor and underground chamber follow the classic basic pattern of earlier pyramid substructures. So the lower chamber sits in an uncomfortable but fertile position. It is close enough to a traditional underground burial plan to keep that possibility alive, but awkward enough in its details to suggest revision, abandonment, or a role that changed during construction. The chamber also contains features that keep it from ever becoming just an unfinished room and nothing more. Opposite the entrance, a blind corridor runs south for about 11 metres, and then continues with a slight bend for another 5.4 metres, measuring roughly 0.75 metres square. A Greek or Roman character was reportedly found on its ceiling, which suggests that the underground chamber may have been accessible in classical antiquity, even though its existence was later forgotten in the Middle Ages, and only rediscovered in 1817 when Giovanni Caviglia cleared rubble from the descending passage. That is a quietly fascinating detail. The lower chamber was not simply ancient in origin, and then untouched until modern archaeology. It seems to have had a more complicated afterlife, known to some ancient visitors, lost again, then reopened by 19th century investigation. The blind corridor adds to that oddness because it looks purposeful without becoming explanatory, just another line of intention running into the rock and then stopping without ceremony. Then there is the pit in the floor, often called Perring's shaft, which is exactly the kind of feature that turns a rough room into a magnet for speculation. The same interior summary notes that the uppermost part of this floor shaft may have ancient origins, but that Giovanni Caviglia and Henry Salt enlarged it, and in 1837 Richard William Howard Vyse ordered it sunk much deeper in hopes of discovering the chamber supposedly surrounded by water that Herodotus had described. The search went on for a very long time by ordinary human standards and produced no hidden chamber. Perring and his workers spent about a year and a half cutting down to the then water level of the Nile, and still nothing like the imagined buried room appeared. That matters because it is one more example of the Great Pyramid training people to expect a dramatic reward and then answering with stubborn refusal. The deep shaft visible today in the subterranean chamber is therefore not simply an original ancient feature in its present form, it is also the scar of later hope, widened and deepened by men who believed the real answer might still be one level below the one they had already reached. There is something almost melancholy in that lower chamber, because so many different kinds of incompletion meet there at once. The ancient builders left an unfinished room. Later explorers enlarged a shaft in the floor and left their own disturbance. Petrie later found the shaft partly filled with rainwater, and the rubble from 19th century digging had to be managed again by early 20th century surveyors. The room therefore preserves not only an interrupted ancient design, but also a layered history of later interference. This is one reason the subterranean chamber can feel strangely honest. It has none of the Upper Pyramid's clean symbolic dignity. It looks worked, altered, argued with, and never entirely resolved. Even its appeal comes from that. It is the kind of place where the monument seems to admit that large projects change mid-thought, and that later generations, unable to bear uncertainty, tend to attack the uncertainty with picks and hope. The well shaft adds another layer of difficulty because it links the lower world to the upper one, in a way that feels both practical and elusive. Ancient Egypt Online notes that a small opening in the west wall of the Grand Gallery leads into this shaft, also called the escape shaft or service shaft, and that it runs down to meet the lower part of the system near the underground chamber. The more detailed interior account describes it as linking the lower end of the Grand Gallery to the bottom of the descending passage about 50 metres farther down, taking a winding and indirect course. It begins in the masonry, then reaches bedrock, then descends further at shifting angles before finally joining the descending route. This is not the kind of clean corridor a tour guide can summarise in one neat gesture. It behaves more like a workaround inside the pyramid, a secretive internal bypass. That's why explanations for it have long centred on practical use. Ancient Egypt Online mentions Petrie's old idea that it may have served as an escape route for workers after the granite blocking stones were lowered into the ascending corridor, while other explanations have seen it as a ventilation shaft for the underground chamber. The problem is that neither explanation closes the case entirely. Even the practical answers feel a little provisional. That uncertainty becomes even more interesting at the grotto, the odd cavity the well shaft passes on its way down. The interior summary describes the grotto as a natural limestone cave, probably a pre-existing cavity that may once have been filled with sand and gravel, before being hollowed out again, later becoming part of the shaft's route. A granite block rests there, and is thought to have come from the portcullis system once associated with the king's chamber. This is one of the strangest little facts in the whole pyramid. Deep inside a monument famous for deliberate geometry and royal control, a natural cave intrudes into the route. The pyramid is usually imagined as pure design imposed over stone. The grotto reminds us that the builders were also negotiating with the landscape beneath them. At that point in the shaft, the clean line of planned passage and the irregularity of geology briefly meet. That makes the space feel almost intimate in the wrong way, as if the pyramid's polished self-possession slips for a moment, and the raw body of the plateau shows through. It is difficult not to admire how awkward the well shaft is once you think about it closely. It is not straight, not elegant, not visible from the outside, and not especially useful to modern visitors except as evidence that the pyramid's interior was more layered than a simple sequence of chambers would suggest. The detailed description notes that the builders seem to have had trouble aligning the lower exit of the shaft, where it joins the descending passage. which is one of those tiny technical details that brings the whole monument back to human scale. Even here, in one of the world's most admired structures, there are signs of difficulty, correction, compromise, and imperfect meeting points. That does not diminish the builders, it makes them more real. The well shaft is not the triumphant face of the monument. It is the side route, the difficult internal connection, the part of the plan where necessity seems to have mattered more than elegance. And because it passes the grotto on the way down, it also becomes the place where construction logic brushes against natural irregularity more directly than almost anywhere else in the pyramid. Taken together, the subterranean chamber, the blind corridor, the floor pit, the well shaft, and the grotto create a completely different picture of the Great Pyramid from the one most people carry around. This is not the bright, clean mental image of a sealed kingly machine with every line perfectly explained. It is a monument with lower spaces that seem to preserve revision, awkward geology, later excavation, and maybe an earlier design stage that was never fully brought to completion. Britannica's broad summary is useful precisely because it is so restrained. The descending corridor ends in an unfinished underground chamber, and the subterranean chambers were never completed. That is the safest foundation. Around that foundation sit the more detailed observations: the rough unfinished western half, the niche in the wall, the blind southern corridor, the floor shaft enlarged by later explorers, the long and crooked well shaft, and the natural cave called the grotto. None of those features forces a single grand theory, but together they make the lower pyramid feel less like an appendix and more like a necessary complication. The monument we think we know from above has a much rougher underside than popular memory allows, and perhaps that is the real importance of these lower spaces. They teach caution. The upper chambers can tempt people into seeing the Great Pyramid as a finished statement from the start, as if the entire interior had always existed in a single perfect conceptual draft. The lower spaces suggest something less simple and more human, a project of enormous control that may still have shifted in plan, adapted to the rock, preserved awkward practical routes, and carried traces of both ancient indecision and later intrusion. That makes the monument more difficult, but also more believable. It is one thing to imagine a perfect pyramid in the abstract. It is another to imagine real builders working downward into bedrock, leaving one chamber incomplete, cutting a winding shaft, passing a natural cavity, and then continuing to refine the higher and more formal parts of the interior. The lower world of the pyramid does not spoil its mystery. It deepens it by giving the mystery texture. And once those rough spaces are in mind, it becomes easier to understand why later generations kept suspecting that the monument still held more than the visible route showed, not only below the known path, but hidden within the body of the pyramid itself, where modern scanning would eventually reveal that stone can conceal emptiness on a much larger scale than anyone crawling through those lower passages could ever have seen. For a very long time, people searched the Great Pyramid the old way. They listened for hollow sounds. They crawled through passages. They measured walls, stared at joints, guessed at blocked routes, and sometimes, with a confidence history rarely rewards, broke things open in the hope that the building would finally stop being difficult. Then the search changed. Instead of asking where a person could go, modern researchers began asking where invisible particles from the sky could go. That shift matters because the big void was not found by torchlight, chisels, or luck. It was found by reading how cosmic ray muons passed through the pyramid stone. In the 2017 Nature paper announcing the discovery, the Scan Pyramids team explained that muons are byproducts of cosmic rays and are only partially absorbed by matter, which means that variations in the muon flux can reveal differences in density inside a monument without cutting into it. That is an extraordinary sentence when you slow it down. The pyramid was not opened further to reveal the void. The sky was used to sense it. There is something almost unfairly elegant about that method. For centuries, the Great Pyramid taught people that its interior could only be known by force, or by physically entering whatever routes already existed. Seismography quietly overturned that habit. The 2017 paper reported that researchers imaged the pyramid non-invasively and found a large void situated above the Grand Gallery, while the 2023 Nature Communications paper described the same broader research program as a non-destructive way to investigate large-scale structures whose internal form remains insufficiently known. So the big void belongs not just to archaeology, but to a change in temperament. Instead of breaking through stone to see what was hidden, the investigators let particles already falling through the pyramid do the work of detection. That makes the discovery feel different from almost every earlier moment in the monument's history. It is not a victory of intrusion, it is a victory of patience. The basic result, stripped of all drama, is already remarkable enough. Nature reported in 2017 that the newly detected space had a cross-section similar to that of the Grand Gallery, a minimum length of 30 metres, and a position above the Grand Gallery. The authors named it the Scan Pyramid's Big Void, and called it the first major inner structure found in the Great Pyramid since the 19th century. That is the heart of it. A large, previously unknown internal space, not a tiny crack or a doubtful anomaly, but a major cavity large enough to demand a place on the internal map of the monument. At the same time, the paper was careful not to pretend the discovery had solved the pyramid. The researchers explicitly said there was currently no information about the intended purpose of the void. In other words, the modern scan revealed something major and left the most human question untouched. What is it for? The Great Pyramid continues to be very good at that. The confidence behind the finding is one reason it caused so much attention. This was not a single odd reading from one machine in one position. The 2017 Nature paper states that the void was first observed with nuclear emulsion films installed in the Queen's chamber, then confirmed with scintillator hodoscopes in the same chamber, and finally reconfirmed with gas detectors outside the pyramid on the north face. The authors emphasised that 3 different muon detection technologies and 3 independent analyses all pointed to the same anomaly. That matters because hidden space stories around the pyramid have a long history of overexcited interpretation. Here, the researchers were trying to do the opposite. They were building a case strong enough that the anomaly could not be dismissed as instrumental noise, wishful thinking, or one team seeing patterns in static. The big void entered the conversation not as a rumour, but as a repeatedly detected feature. If you are wondering how muons can do this at all, the basic idea is pleasantly concrete once it is translated out of physics language. Muons arrive from the atmosphere after cosmic rays strike high above Earth. Stone absorbs some of them. Empty space absorbs less. The 2023 Nature Communications paper explains that by measuring the muon flux in a given direction, researchers can estimate the mean density in that line of sight, producing density maps that reveal internal structure. It is not like taking a normal photograph. You do not get a neat colour image of a room with a doorway and a floor vase waiting in the corner. What you get is a density anomaly that says, in effect, there is less stone here than there should be if the pyramid were solid in this region. That distinction is important. Modern scans revealed the existence, scale, and general location of the big void. They did not give the world a crisp interior portrait of a hidden chamber, fully seen from within. That gap between detection and direct visualization is one reason the big void still feels so powerful. It is known, but not known in the old physical sense. No person has walked into it. No robot has rolled through it. No endoscopic camera has delivered a cinematic reveal of its inner surfaces. The 2017 paper tells us the void is above the Grand Gallery and at least 30 metres long, with a cross-section similar to that famous rising corridor, but it does not claim that the exact intended purpose has been identified, and later papers discussing the pyramid continue to present the big void in terms of model hypotheses rather than a settled architectural description. The 2023 Nature Communications article even refers to the earlier publication's horizontal and inclined hypotheses for the big void in its figure materials, which is a useful reminder that the space's precise orientation and full geometry were not fixed into one universally agreed shape by the first announcement. Modern scans gave us a real void, and also a real boundary around our confidence. That makes the big void unusual even within pyramid history. Earlier discoveries often came with immediate sensory experience. A corridor is entered, a chamber is measured, a blocking stone is photographed. The big void arrived first as an anomaly in data, and then as a converging fact across multiple detector systems. That is a colder way of knowing, and in some respects a stronger one. It also means the void has carried an unusual burden in the public imagination. Some people heard big void and mentally furnished it at once, as if the phrase must refer to a hidden hall, an archive, an undiscovered burial room, or a chamber waiting patiently with answers inside. The evidence does not justify that leap. What the 2017 paper supports is a large internal cavity above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 metres long and detected with high confidence. What it does not support is a tidy story about contents or function. That uncertainty is not a weakness of the discovery. It is the discovery's real shape. Location matters here, because above the Grand Gallery is not a trivial phrase. The Grand Gallery is already one of the strangest known spaces inside the Great Pyramid, a tall corbelled passage leading toward the King's Chamber system. To find a major, previously unknown void above that part of the internal architecture immediately raises serious questions about construction, load management, or design. The 2017 paper itself was cautious, refusing to assign a purpose, but it did describe the big void as having a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery, which naturally encouraged comparisons, not identity, not proof that it is another Grand Gallery, but similarity in scale and form. The 2023 paper's figure materials also continue to place the big void in relation to the Grand Gallery, and show that later analysis of other anomalies was conducted in a pyramid model where the big void remained part of the monument's newly expanded internal landscape. Once that happens, the whole building changes. The known interior is no longer the whole interior. This is also why the discovery felt like a shock, even to people who already knew the pyramid was not fully understood. Many historians and archaeologists were perfectly aware that the Great Pyramid could still surprise us. Fewer were expecting a newly reported internal structure on that scale. Nature summarised the 2017 result as the first major inner structure found since the 19th century, and that phrase carries real weight. It means the monument was not merely yielding another reinterpretation of an old feature, it was yielding a major addition to the map after well over a century of modern interest. That alone would have been enough to revive attention. But the method mattered too. Because the void was detected by mography rather than invasive tunnelling, it also represented a proof of concept. The pyramid could still be read in new ways without being damaged in the process. Once the big void was announced, one predictable argument followed almost immediately. Was this really new, or were there already supposed cavities in that general zone for structural reasons? The debate is understandable because the Great Pyramid already contains known relieving spaces, corridors, and internal architecture that redirect weight or protect chambers. But the 2017 Nature paper did not present the anomaly as one more familiar cavity on an old plan. It presented it as a large, previously unknown void, detected independently by 3 different techniques, above the Grand Gallery, and substantial enough to count as a major inner structure. That wording is careful. It does not pretend to know the void's purpose. It does insist that the void itself is real and archaeologically significant. The safest reading is therefore also the strongest one. The scan revealed a major empty or lower density space we had not previously mapped, but it did not tell us exactly why the builders created it, or whether it was intended as one continuous chamber, a stress relief system, a construction space, or something else. In a way, the big void is a perfect modern pyramid discovery, because it gives us scale without spectacle. There was no coffin in view, no inscription suddenly legible, no statue pulled from dust. There was instead a geometry problem, a region in the pyramid where the stone should have absorbed more muons than it did. And from that difference, a hidden absence took shape. It is difficult to think of a cleaner example of how the Great Pyramid resists the old habits of treasure hunting. What modern scans revealed inside the pyramid was not treasure, but emptiness. Not emptiness in the disappointed sense, but emptiness as evidence. An unfilled internal volume on that scale is itself a find. In architecture, a void is a decision. In a monument this massive, a void can be as informative as a wall. Later developments in the Scan Pyramid's mission help reinforce that point. In 2023, an open-access Nature Communications paper reported the first precise analysis of another previously identified anomaly, the Scan Pyramid's north face corridor, describing it as a corridor-shaped structure about 9 meters long, with a transverse section of about 2.0 by 2.0 meters behind the north face chevron area. Then in 2025, a scientific reports paper described multimodal non-destructive testing that confirmed that same north face corridor using ground-penetrating radar, ultrasonic testing, and electrical resistivity tomography. These later results are not the big void itself, but they matter because they show the broader scanning program was not a one-hit wonder. The pyramid has continued to yield hidden internal structures to careful, non-destructive investigation. That gives the big void a more stable setting. It sits inside a growing pattern of modern detections, not in isolation, as one anomalous headline from 2017. At the same time, the later corridor discovery also highlights a difference in knowability. The north face corridor was eventually characterized much more precisely and physically inspected through an endoscopic opening, which is why public understanding of it became sharper. The big void has not yet had that kind of direct interior glimpse, so it continues to occupy a more abstract place in the imagination, more certain than a rumour, less tangible than a filmed corridor. The 2017 paper gave us a minimum length and approximate relation to the Grand Gallery. Later references continue to model its possible orientation, but the void remains, in the most literal sense, unseen from within. It is one of the few major archaeological discoveries that can be both highly credible and visually elusive at the same time. That combination probably explains why people keep trying to turn it into whatever theory they already preferred. When evidence is strong but not pictorial, imagination rushes to help, usually a little too quickly. This is the place where a calm reading matters most. There is a temptation to say the big void must be one of three things: a hidden chamber with a symbolic or ritual role, a structural cavity created to reduce weight or manage stresses, or a leftover construction space tied to how the pyramid was raised. Each of those ideas has something going for it. None has been demonstrated by the scan evidence alone. The 2017 paper is admirably restrained on this point. It reports the void and explicitly says there is currently no information about its intended purpose. That sentence is easy to glide past, but it is probably the most responsible line in the whole story. It reminds us that detection is not interpretation. Archaeology advances in two steps that do not always arrive together. First, something is shown to exist. Then, much more slowly, people argue about what that existence means. The big void is still living in the space between those two steps. There is also a deeper reason the discovery landed so hard in the public mind. The Great Pyramid has always carried a strange balance between overexposure and underknowledge. Everybody knows the shape. Very few people can sketch the interior with confidence. The big void sharpened that mismatch in an unforgettable way. A monument so famous it risks becoming background noise turned out to contain a major hidden space above one of its best-known internal features, and modern science found it not by entering a new passage, but by reading cosmic particles. It is hard to design a better reminder that fame is not the same thing as understanding. The pyramid everyone thought they broadly understood still had a large silence inside it. that is the kind of fact that lingers, and perhaps that is the gentlest way to think about the big void before moving on. Modern scans reveal that the Great Pyramid is still internally incomplete in our minds. They revealed a major cavity above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 metres long, detected independently by 3 Muon-based methods, and still without an agreed function. They also helped open a broader era in which non-destructive techniques could find other hidden structures, like the North Face corridor later characterised in 2023 and confirmed again in 2025. What the scans did not reveal was the satisfying old adventure ending where a hidden room suddenly explains itself. Instead, they gave us a cleaner, stranger truth. Inside all that famous stone, absence still has shape, and once you accept that, the next question stops being whether the pyramid hides anything at all. The answer to that is now yes. The harder question is what those empty spaces were doing there, and why a monument so determined to survive also seems so determined to keep part of its interior life just beyond the reach of certainty. By this point in the story, it becomes worth asking the question in the plainest possible way. After all the tunnels, all the chambers, all the shafts, all the modern scans and robotic cameras and arguments over what every feature might mean, what was actually found inside the Great Pyramid? Not what people hoped to find, not what later legends promised, not what documentaries like to hint at just before the music changes. What was really there? The answer is both simpler and stranger than many people expect. What was found inside the Great Pyramid was, first of all, much less stuff than popular imagination usually wants. Britannica puts it very plainly. The pyramids of Giza are mostly solid masses of stone with very little to be found inside, and the Great Pyramid itself contains very little open space within its huge mass. In the King's Chamber, what later visitors found was a small granite-lined room with bare walls and an enormous granite sarcophagus or coffer, but not the intact royal burial, treasure, and dramatic decoration people often imagine. Britannica also notes that by the late 18th century the pyramid would already have long been plundered, which helps explain why later entrants found so little in the way of obvious grave goods. That tends to disappoint people at first, but only because they have been trained to think that discovery means objects. Gold means discovery, jewels mean discovery, a sealed coffin means discovery. The Great Pyramid has always had a different temperament. It has given us passages, chambers, load-bearing strategies, hidden compartments, work marks, blocked shafts and voids. It has given us architecture more often than artifacts, and that is not a lesser result. In many ways, it is the real result. The monument is mostly solid stone, and the things actually found inside it are best understood as selected interruptions in that mass. The descending passage, the ascending passage, the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber, the subterranean chamber, the well shaft, the grotto, the relieving chambers, the narrow shafts from the upper chambers, and now the big void detected above the Grand Gallery. What was found, in the broadest sense, was not a treasure house. It was a carefully controlled interior. The King's Chamber is a good place to begin, because it shows both the limit of the treasure story and the strength of the architectural story. The room is small, lined with massive granite blocks and bare on the walls. The great granite coffer remains there, but not the mummy, not a dazzling burial assemblage, not a full written explanation of the room's role. Britannica's summary is almost refreshingly blunt. Later visitors would not have found the rumoured treasures there, only the enormous granite sarcophagus, once containing the king's mummy. That absence matters. It means the room we might expect to be the pyramid's great payoff is instead austere, controlled, and almost severe. It also means that what later generations actually found inside the chamber was not spectacle, but evidence of restraint. The room was built to matter without needing to advertise itself. That same pattern repeats just above it. Over the King's Chamber, explorers eventually found 5 hidden relieving compartments, separated by massive granite slabs, apparently designed to divert the immense weight of masonry above and protect the chamber ceiling below. Those spaces were not there to be admired. They were there because architecture at this scale needed hidden intelligence, and in those cramped upper spaces, later investigators found some of the most important marks in the whole monument: red ochre quarry graffiti and work gang inscriptions linked to Khufu. So what was actually found over the chamber ceiling was not a secret treasury, but a structural solution and traces of the people who built it. The monument answered the old dream of hidden chambers with something much more grounded and, in some ways, much more impressive. It said, in effect, here is how we kept the room alive under all this stone, and here are the names left by the crews while they did it. The so-called Queen's Chamber tells a similar story in a different key. What was found there was a limestone chamber with a high niche in the east wall, bare surfaces, and two narrow shafts hidden in its north and south walls. Not a queen's burial laid out neatly for interpretation, not a room that explains itself on sight. The chamber's very nickname is misleading, and Britannica explicitly treats it as a misnomer. What later investigation found in connection with it were the so-called Dixon relics, modest objects rather than royal treasure: a stone ball, a copper hook, and a piece of cedar wood. Then, much later, robotic exploration found that the two tiny shafts ended in carefully fitted limestone blocking stones, with copper fittings on at least one of them, and a second barrier beyond the first in the southern shaft. So again, what was actually found was not a chamber of riches. It was a chamber of questions, and then more questions hidden in routes too small for a person to follow. The lower interior deepens the same lesson. Beneath the main body of the monument, explorers found the descending passage leading into the bedrock and ending in an unfinished subterranean chamber. Britannica's summary that the underground chambers were never completed is important here, because it helps explain the peculiar mood of the lower spaces. What was found below was a rougher, less finished world: an unfinished chamber cut into rock, a blind corridor, a shaft in the floor later enlarged by 19th century explorers, the winding well shaft, and the natural cavity called the grotto. None of that fits the clean fantasy of a fully sealed, perfectly settled interior waiting to deliver one final hidden room. The lower pyramid looks more like a design history still visible in stone, with traces of changing plans, incomplete work, and later human interference. It is the opposite of a neat answer, and that is exactly why it matters. Then modern scanning changed the scale of the question. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids team reported the discovery of a large void above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 metres long, detected non-invasively using cosmic ray muons, and confirmed by 3 different measurement approaches. The researchers were very careful not to overclaim. They reported a major inner structure, and explicitly said there was no information yet about its intended purpose. That caution is part of what makes the big void so important. What was actually found was not a filmed hidden room full of meaning handed over in one dramatic moment. It was a large empty or lower density space inside one of the most famous monuments on Earth, revealed by physics before it was revealed by sight. Once again, the pyramid answered curiosity not with objects, but with absence shaped so deliberately that absence itself became evidence. This is where the phrase, meaning of absence, becomes more than a nice line. In ordinary life, empty often means unimportant. In ancient monuments, especially in architecture, this controlled empty can mean several things at once. It can mean robbed. It can mean unfinished. It can mean symbolic restraint. It can mean a structural necessity. It can mean we are looking at a route, a buffer, a cavity, or a room whose role was never to impress later visitors. The Great Pyramid contains all of these possibilities. The King's Chamber is bare not because it was casually neglected, but because pyramids of Khufu's era were more austere inside. Britannica notes that Egyptians only began decorating burial chambers with hieroglyphic texts in later pyramids, and Britannica's entry on Unas identifies him as the first ruler to inscribe the interior of his pyramid with the pyramid texts. That means one of the most famous absences in the Great Pyramid, the lack of wall texts in its main chamber, is not simply a puzzle, it is also a historical clue. In other words, some absences that people treat as suspicious are actually period appropriate. The bare walls of the King's Chamber do not automatically signal missing secrets. They also reflect the fact that this pyramid belongs to a stage in royal funerary architecture before the inscribed inner chambers of later dynasties became standard. That does not remove all mystery from the room, but it does change the kind of mystery we are dealing with. We are not standing in a failed later tomb stripped of every explanatory surface. We are standing in an earlier kind of royal interior, austere by design, and then later emptied further by the loss or removal of burial contents. So even when the room appears to offer nothing, that nothing is doing historical work, it tells us about time, sequence, and the evolution of Egyptian royal burial practice. The same is true of the hidden features. A blocking stone at the end of a shaft can seem disappointing if one expected a secret chamber beyond it. But even without a grand room behind it, the blocking stone still tells us that the shaft was not casual. A relieving chamber above the King's Chamber can seem dull if one wanted a hidden archive. But the very existence of that compartment tells us the builders were thinking carefully about weight, pressure, and survival across deep time. A large void above the Grand Gallery can feel frustrating because it has not yet explained itself, yet its very presence tells us the internal organisation of the pyramid is more layered than the old simplified diagrams allowed. An empty chamber can disappoint only if the standard of value is treasure. If the standard is evidence, the Great Pyramid is full of findings. This is why the Great Pyramid has aged so well as a mystery. It is not merely hiding objects, it is hiding intention. Objects are simpler. Either they are there or they are not. Intention is harder. A room can survive while its meaning becomes contested. A shaft can remain physically present while its purpose drifts out of reach. A void can be mapped and still not interpreted. The monument has repeatedly given later investigators what they asked for in one sense, and denied it in another. Yes, there are chambers. Yes, there are concealed spaces. Yes, there are hidden features. Yes, there are marks left by workers. Yes, there are voids still being detected. But no, the building does not line these up into a single easy statement. It keeps forcing each generation back into the same position. You have found something real, now decide whether you actually understand it. So if someone asked, in one sentence, what was actually found in the Great Pyramid's hidden chambers, the answer would be this. Not the spectacular cache of objects people long imagined, but a set of rooms, shafts, relieving spaces, work marks, blocking stones, unfinished lower chambers, and major internal voids that together reveal a monument far more selective, intelligent, and architecturally complex than its famous outer shape suggests. And if they asked what the emptiness means, the answer would have to be just as careful. Sometimes it means loss. Sometimes it means chronology. Sometimes it means construction. Sometimes it means that a void was part of the plan. Most of all, it means that the pyramid was never obliged to satisfy the fantasies projected onto it. It only had to remain itself, a mostly solid mass of stone with a few chosen interruptions, and those interruptions have turned out to be enough to keep the whole monument alive in the mind. That may be the quietest truth in all of this. The Great Pyramid did not defeat curiosity by containing nothing. It defeated curiosity by containing just enough chambers to prove there was a plan, just enough emptiness to keep interpretation open, just enough hiddenness to prevent the story from ever settling completely. And once you see that, the next question almost forms by itself, because an empty chamber can still produce a very loud rumour. If the pyramid did not yield the lost records, the sealed library, the final explanation so many people hoped for, then why have those ideas stayed attached to it for so long, and what exactly in the monument's silence made generations keep imagining that something larger had once been there, waiting just beyond the last known stone. By now, the most tempting mistake is to assume that the Great Pyramid must be hiding one last dramatic thing: a library, a sealed archive, lost books, secret records of a civilization older than Egypt. A chamber that finally explains why the monument was built, how it was planned, and what everyone else somehow missed. That temptation makes emotional sense. A building this famous, this massive, and this internally selective seems almost designed to provoke the feeling that something important has been withheld. But the history of the pyramid is full of moments when expectation outran evidence, and this is one of the biggest of them. The more carefully people have looked, the more the monument has offered architecture, traces of work, and controlled silence rather than a neat cache of written answers. That is not a failure of discovery. It is part of the monument's character. One reason the fantasy of lost records stays so strong is that the actual interior is so restrained. Britannica is very clear on this point. The pyramids of Giza are mostly solid masses of stone, with very little to be found inside. And contrary to what many people expect, there are no hieroglyphic texts, treasures, or mummies in any of the Giza pyramids. It also notes that decoration inside pyramids began several centuries after the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure were built. In other words, the Great Pyramid is not quiet because its words were obviously torn off the walls. It is quiet because it belongs to a phase of pyramid building in which the grand inner chambers were still largely bare by design. That is a crucial difference. The silence is not only damage, some of it is original. That point changes the whole emotional shape of the mystery. If the king's chamber had once been fully covered in funerary spells and wall texts, then their absence would tell one sort of story. But Britannica's overview of the pyramid texts places the earliest known examples in the Pyramid of Unas, a ruler of the late 5th dynasty, well after Khufu. So the Great Pyramid stands before that tradition of inscribed royal burial chambers had fully taken hold. Its bare interior therefore cannot automatically be treated as evidence of missing secret wisdom. Sometimes a room is bare because it was meant to be austere, not because a library vanished from it. That does not make the room easier to explain, but it does make it harder to load with modern expectations that do not fit its historical moment. At the same time, not every absence inside the pyramid is original. Some of it is almost certainly the result of loss. Britannica notes that any treasure originally deposited in the Giza pyramids would have been plundered in ancient and medieval times, and that this likely affected the bodies of the kings themselves, which have never been found. Its shorter explainer on the Great Pyramid says much the same thing. By the end of the 18th century, later visitors would already have found the structure long plundered, with only the granite sarcophagus remaining in the king's chamber. So the monument's silence has at least two layers. One layer belongs to the period in which it was built, before the richly inscribed interiors of later pyramids. The other layer belongs to centuries of intrusion, removal, and loss. Together they create the peculiar atmosphere of the Great Pyramid, a building that was already restrained when whole, and became even more silent after being emptied. That combination is powerful because it leaves just enough room for imagination to run wild. The rooms are real, the roots are real, the hidden spaces are real. But the ordinary explanatory things people hope for are mostly not there. No long inscription in the king's chamber telling us what function every passage served. No intact burial installation preserving every ritual step. No royal archive stacked along the walls, and when a building this large withholds that kind of closure, the human mind begins to substitute. It says perhaps the records were moved, perhaps they were hidden elsewhere, perhaps the visible chambers were decoys, perhaps the true archive still lies in some inaccessible cavity. Once that habit begins, every blank wall starts to look less like stone and more like a refusal. That habit is older than most people realise. Medieval Islamic writings about ancient Egypt helped build a tradition. in which the pyramids were not only tombs or monuments, but repositories of ancient wisdom. The Ancient Near East Today summarizes one important strand of this tradition by noting that Said al-Andalusi connected Hermes or Idris with Egypt and claimed that he built ancient temples, or the pyramids, to preserve knowledge before the Great Flood. The same article notes that similar stories appeared in other texts, and that later writers like al-Makrizi described al-Mamun's attempt to excavate one of the pyramids. That means the idea of the pyramids as vaults of knowledge was already active long before modern fringe theories, television speculation, or internet threads made them noisy again. The Lost Records fantasy did not arrive yesterday. It has deep roots in the monument's post-ancient reputation. Once those stories existed, they changed the emotional stakes of every later opening. A person entering the Great Pyramid was no longer just entering a royal tomb. He might believe he was entering a storehouse of pre-flood knowledge, or a structure built to preserve wisdom against catastrophe, or a place where the old sciences of the world had been hidden from time. That helps explain why disappointment never really ended the search. If a first chamber turned out to be bare, perhaps the real archive was deeper. If one known room was empty, perhaps the true records lay behind a hidden wall. The more the monument withheld, the easier it became for later stories to insist that withholding was the whole point. Silence began to look intentional in the most dramatic sense, not simply architectural. Modern Hall of Records mythology added another layer, though it is important to state this carefully. Strictly speaking, the most famous modern Hall of Records story is attached to the Sphinx area rather than the interior of the Great Pyramid itself. Smithsonian recounts that Edgar Cayce claimed in the 1930s that Atlantean refugees buried their secrets in a hall of records under the Sphinx, and that it would be discovered before the end of the 20th century. The same article goes on to describe how later scientific work around the Sphinx, including remote sensing, found only expected cracks and fissures in the limestone, and later intrusive passages rather than a hidden Atlantean archive. But myths do not respect tidy property boundaries. Once Giza becomes the stage for lost records in the public imagination, the Great Pyramid naturally gets drafted into the same dream. The Sphinx may receive the label, but the pyramid receives the atmosphere. That spillover matters because the Great Pyramid is better suited to carrying the mood of hidden knowledge than almost any other structure on Earth. It is mostly solid. It contains only a few selected interior roots. Some of those roots end in blocking stones. Some lead to unfinished lower spaces. Some, like the modernly detected big void above the Grand Gallery, reveal that even now the inner map is not complete. Nature's 2017 paper described the big void as a large internal cavity, with a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery, and a minimum length of 30 metres, detected with high confidence by 3 different Muon imaging methods, while also stressing that there was no information yet about its intended purpose. That is exactly the kind of fact that feeds the old instinct. A major hidden space exists, but it does not explain itself. The pyramid keeps offering evidence without surrendering interpretation. And yet, when the pyramid does speak clearly, it tends to do so in a very different register from the one legend prefers. Instead of hidden libraries, it gives us quarry marks above the king's chamber. Instead of sacred scrolls, it gives us work gang names painted in red ochre in structural spaces. Instead of a revealed final room at the end of the queen's chamber shafts, it gives us carefully fitted blocking stones, a tiny cavity behind the first one, a second stone beyond, and markings in a space no human body can enter directly. Ancient Egypt Online summarizes that the Queen's chamber shafts were originally bricked up, later rediscovered, and that robotic work revealed a second blocking stone beyond the first in the southern shaft. The University of Leeds similarly notes that a second blocking stone remains beyond the small chamber reached by the robot, so even where the pyramid provides a hidden feature, it rarely rewards curiosity with a grand answer. It offers another layer of selectivity. This is one reason the silence holds so well. The pyramid is not mute in an absolute sense. It is selective in what kind of voice it preserves. It preserves engineering. It preserves labour traces. It preserves layout. It preserves evidence of planning and of revision. It preserves cavities, barriers, and bare volumes. What it does not preserve in any obvious way is a comfortable written commentary on itself. If you're hoping for an archive, that feels frustrating. If you are paying attention to architecture, it feels almost consistent. The monument communicates through stone choices more than through sentences. It tells you how weight was managed. It tells you where movement was permitted and where it was denied. It tells you that some routes were meant to terminate in closure. It tells you that hidden spaces existed, though not always for theatrical reasons. It does not sit down and dictate a memoir. There is also a more ordinary explanation for why lost records never quite go away. An empty room is psychologically unstable. People do not like spending much time with an important emptiness. If a small storage closet is empty, nobody cares. If the greatest pyramid in Egypt contains a bare granite chamber, a misnamed middle chamber, a rough unfinished room beneath the ground, and now a large void still not directly entered, people begin to treat emptiness as a clue rather than a condition. That is understandable. Big monuments make us assume big content. When the content is not visible, we imagine either that it was taken or that it remains hidden. Often both ideas live side by side, which is why the Great Pyramid is so good at generating parallel theories that contradict one another without reducing anyone's confidence. But the calmer answer is that the pyramid guards its silence well because its silence is made from several very durable things at once. It is made from chronology, because the monument predates the inscribed burial chambers of later royal pyramids. It is made from plunder, because whatever movable burial goods were originally there did not survive in place. It is made from architecture, because most of the structure is deliberately solid and only selectively hollow. It is made from concealment, because some features were hidden within walls, over ceilings, or along shafts too narrow for human entry. And now it is made from preservation, because modern researchers are often rightly reluctant to damage the monument simply to satisfy a dramatic curiosity. Once all of that is in place, the silence becomes extremely hard to break. Notice too how often the Great Pyramid turns the search for records into a search for traces. This is a quieter kind of reading. Instead of asking where is the lost library, one asks, where are the tiny pieces of human evidence that survived where no one expected them? The red marks in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, the little objects found in the queen's chamber shaft area, the mason's lines and coloured markings glimpsed by robot behind one blocking stone. The very fact that a large hidden void can now be detected non-destructively above the Grand Gallery. These are not records in the dramatic sense, but they are records in the broader human sense. They are remnants of action, planning, sequence, labour and intention. The pyramid has not given us a book. It has given us a file system made of absences, traces and difficult spaces. That is part of why the monument can feel so unreasonably alive in the mind. If it were truly empty in the absolute sense, interest would fade. If it were fully explicit, interest would also fade. Instead, it lives in the middle ground. Enough is present to prove design. Enough is missing to keep explanation open. Enough later legend accumulated around it to make every absence feel charged. And enough real discoveries continue to happen, like the big void found by Mography, to remind us that the structure is still capable of surprising careful people without rewarding careless certainty. The pyramid guards its silence well because it never withholds everything. It only withholds enough. There is also a small but important distinction between silence and secrecy. Secrecy suggests that someone hid a specific answer, and that if we only found the right chamber, everything would line up. Silence is different. Silence can be the result of time, damage, selective design, historical distance, and the simple fact that ancient builders were not thinking about modern historians needing footnotes. The Great Pyramid may contain secrets in the sense that parts of its internal logic remain unresolved. But it is also silent in a broader way, the way a very old building becomes silent after the people who understood its full design world are gone. That kind of silence is not necessarily a locked drawer waiting for a key. Sometimes it is a whole language reduced to fragments. And that, I think, is why the pyramid keeps defeating the dream of lost records without ever curing the desire for them. Every generation comes close enough to the monument to feel that an answer must exist, but never quite close enough to stop wanting one. The rooms are too deliberate to be meaningless. The emptiness is too controlled to feel accidental. The few surviving traces are too suggestive to feel trivial. Yet the building refuses the simple reward of a discovered archive. It does not hand over a shelf of scrolls and say, "There, now you can all calm down." It continues instead in the older, harder way, with chamber after chamber telling us only part of what it knows. So when people ask whether the Great Pyramid once held lost records, or whether there was nothing at all, the most honest answer sits somewhere between those extremes. There was not nothing. There were chambers, roots, structural spaces, work marks, buried features, and probably original burial goods later lost to plunder. But there is also no good archaeological evidence that the pyramid contained the grand hidden library so many later traditions wanted from it. The silence is real, but it is not empty in the simple sense. It is made of what survived, what was removed, what was never written there to begin with, and what still cannot be fully entered without harming the monument. Once that starts to settle in, the old frustration changes shape a little. The empty chambers stop looking like failed discoveries and begin to look like evidence with a different tone, which is where the last quiet thought naturally waits. After everything we have walked through together, it may seem almost unfair that the Great Pyramid still withholds so much. We have gone inside the known rooms. We have looked above the king's chamber into the hidden relieving spaces. We have followed the old forced openings and the later careful studies. We have gone down into the rough subterranean chamber below the body of the monument. We have stood in the so-called Queen's Chamber and looked at its niche and its strange narrow shafts. We have followed robots into passages too small for a person, right up to the fitted blocking stones deep inside the masonry. We have even stepped into the modern age and watched physicists use particles from the sky to detect a great hidden void above the Grand Gallery. And after all that, the Great Pyramid still does not give us the kind of answer people usually want. No final archive, no room full of written explanations, no perfect scene in which a hidden chamber opens and everything suddenly makes sense. At first glance, that can feel disappointing. A person can spend years reading about the pyramid and still end up with a list of things that are real, but incomplete. A granite chamber with a coffer but no body. Hidden relieving spaces above it with work marks but no ceremony. A middle chamber whose name misleads more than it helps. Shafts with carefully placed blocking stones that do not quite behave like doors. A lower chamber cut into bedrock that looks unfinished. A large void above the Grand Gallery that can be detected with confidence, but still not entered in the ordinary way. Even the things that are known clearly often refuse to settle into a single function that everyone accepts. But perhaps that is the wrong way to measure what the empty chambers have already told us. Because emptiness is not always a failure of history. Sometimes it is the form history takes when a building has outlived the people who could read it easily. Sometimes it is what remains after time. Theft, weather, rumour and changing worlds have all taken their turn. Sometimes it is what architecture leaves behind when objects are gone, and sometimes emptiness is not a lack at all, but a decision preserved in stone. That is one of the quiet lessons of the Great Pyramid. Most of its body was never meant to be hollow. Most of the monument is solid mass. The builders selected a very small number of places to interrupt that mass with passages, chambers, shafts, cavities and structural spaces. Once you begin to think in those terms, the empty places become more interesting, not less. They're not empty because the builders ran out of ideas. They're empty because emptiness was part of the design. A passage exists because movement mattered there. A chamber exists because that volume mattered there. A relieving space exists because pressure had to be managed there. A shaft exists because a line through the stone mattered there, whether for air, symbol, ritual, construction, or some combination we still struggle to define. Even a void whose function remains unknown still tells us one basic thing with certainty. Someone allowed space to exist inside mass. That matters. It matters because the Great Pyramid is so often reduced to scale alone. People say it is huge, it is old, it is precise, it is famous, and all of that is true. But scale can make a monument feel blunt in the mind, almost too large to think about properly. The interior corrects that impression. The hidden spaces tell us that this was not merely a giant pile of stone raised to overwhelm the eye. It was organised from within. Decisions were made about what would be seen, what would be concealed, what would be supported, what would remain accessible, and what would be closed away. Empty chambers tell us that the builders were not only concerned with bulk, they were concerned with arrangement. An arrangement is a kind of thought made visible. That may be one reason the empty chambers continue to feel so active in the imagination. A room with treasure says one thing. A room without treasure can say many things at once. It can say that the contents were removed. It can say that the room served a purpose beyond storage. It can say that the architecture itself was part of the message. It can say that what modern people think should matter is not always what ancient builders thought mattered most. In the King's Chamber, for example, what remains is not a busy display of royal wealth. What remains is shape, proportion, granite, weight, and a stone coffer. The room is not trying to entertain anyone. It is not trying to charm the visitor. It is simply there, controlled and severe, as if to remind us that importance and decoration are not the same thing. The same can be said of the so-called Queen's Chamber, though in a different way. It feels like a room that ought to explain itself. It has the niche, it has the shafts, it sits at a meaningful level within the monument, yet it keeps refusing the neat label later ages gave it. That refusal is frustrating only if we believe old buildings owe us instant clarity. In truth, it is completely normal for a structure from more than 4,000 years ago to keep some of its logic to itself. What makes the Queen's Chamber interesting is not that it has failed to explain itself. It is that it has continued to provoke serious questions, precisely because it is so clearly deliberate. If it were a rough unfinished space, we could dismiss it more easily. If it were lavishly decorated, we could read it more easily. Instead, it sits in between, purposeful, spare, and just uncertain enough to keep drawing the mind back. Even the lower spaces beneath the pyramid, rough as they are, speak in their own way. The subterranean chamber does not look like a polished final answer. It looks like a place where work was done, perhaps changed, perhaps left incomplete. The blind corridor, the floor shaft, the winding well shaft, the grotto where the natural rock intrudes into the planned route, all of these features make the lower interior feel less like a polished symbol and more like a working history. That, too, is valuable. Empty or unfinished spaces remind us that large monuments are not born complete in a single perfect gesture. They are made by people solving problems, changing plans, working against stone, adjusting to conditions, and sometimes leaving traces of uncertainty behind. The lower pyramid is important partly because it makes the builders look more human, not less impressive. It shows that control at this scale did not mean effortless perfection. It meant persistence. And then there are the hidden features that seem almost designed to keep modesty in the conversation. The red marks above the King's Chamber are not grand royal inscriptions meant to dazzle future ages. They are workmanlike traces in a structural area no one was meant to admire. The tiny cavity behind the first blocking stone in the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber is not a dramatic hidden room with a theatrical reveal. It is a small concealed space that leads to yet another stone. The big void detected above the Grand Gallery does not arrive with a triumphant explanation attached. It arrives as a fact waiting for interpretation. Time and again, the Great Pyramid seems to insist that the most important discoveries inside it are not necessarily the most glamorous ones. That may sound like a sober lesson, but it is also a comforting one. It means we do not need the pyramid to become stranger than it already is. A lot of people, when faced with ancient monuments, feel the urge to force the mystery upward until it becomes unbelievable. The room must contain a lost library. The shaft must lead to ultimate revelation. The void must hide the one answer that settles all arguments forever. But the real discoveries are already enough. A monument this old, built with this level of control, still contains concealed structural spaces, blocked miniature routes, worker marks hidden over a ceiling, unfinished lower chambers, and large internal voids only modern physics could reveal. That is not a shortage of wonder. That is a surplus of it. The emptiness also tells us something about ourselves, which is perhaps why these stories fit so well at the end of the day, when the mind is a little less guarded and a little more honest. Human beings do not like leaving important spaces empty. We want to fill them with explanations. If a room matters, we want to know why. If a chamber is hidden, we want to know what it protected. If a route ends at a stone barrier, we want to know what lies beyond. If the known rooms contain too little, we begin inventing the room that must exist elsewhere. In that sense, the Great Pyramid is not only a monument of ancient Egypt, it is also a monument to the human discomfort with partial knowledge. That discomfort can lead people into nonsense, of course. There is no shortage of that around the pyramids. But beneath the nonsense is a very ordinary feeling. People want important things to explain themselves. When they do not, the mind starts building explanations on their behalf. The Great Pyramid has resisted that for a very long time. It is famous enough to invite every theory, old enough to outlast most of them, and solid enough that many claims simply cannot be checked without risking damage to the monument itself. That last part is especially important. In the past, people often met uncertainty with force. They tunnelled, blasted, pried, and dug. The modern search has become more careful, and rightly so. Muon scans, endoscopic cameras, robotic crawlers, ground-penetrating radar, careful mapping. This means we now know more while also accepting that some questions cannot be answered quickly or destructively. There is a kind of maturity in that. We no longer assume that every mystery must be broken open to be worth studying, and perhaps that is another thing empty chambers can teach. Restraint. A monument like the Great Pyramid rewards patience better than aggression. The old approach said, there is a secret. Breakthrough. The newer approach says, there is a pattern. Observe more carefully. That shift changes the meaning of emptiness. An empty space is no longer only a disappointment after intrusion. It becomes data. A void becomes a clue. A hidden cavity becomes part of the structural and symbolic life of the building, whether or not it holds an object. This is a quieter kind of knowledge, but a more durable one. It allows the monument to remain itself while still giving something back. There is also comfort, I think, in the idea that not everything important has to end with a final reveal. We are trained by stories to expect closure. A locked room should open. A mystery should resolve. A hidden chamber should contain the thing that justifies all the suspense. Real history is rarely so tidy. Often what survives is fragmentary, displaced, partial, damaged, or silent. And yet those fragments can still say a great deal. The Great Pyramid does not offer closure in the storybook sense, but it offers something more realistic and maybe more useful. It offers a clear demonstration that humans long ago were capable of planning at a scale and with a discipline that still humbles us. It offers proof that architecture can preserve decisions long after it loses its commentary. It offers evidence that even absence can be intentional. And it offers one stubborn reminder after another that the world is not emptied of meaning just because it has been emptied of objects. That is worth holding on to beyond Egypt as well. There are many places in life where the visible contents disappear and only the structure remains. An old house after the family has gone, a workshop after the tools are removed. A theatre after the seats are empty and the stage lights are off. You can still tell what sort of life happened there by the shape of the space, by what was built to support what, by where people once moved and where they were not meant to go. The Great Pyramid works like that, only on a scale so large we sometimes miss the familiarity of the lesson. Empty chambers can still tell us about priority, movement, control, fear, care, labour, planning and belief. They do not need to contain everything to say something true. And there is another small comfort in the pyramid's silence. It reminds us that knowledge does not only come from speaking. Some things are learned from what is withheld, what is unfinished, what is protected, what is missing, and what remains difficult to enter. The hidden spaces inside the pyramid have forced every generation to slow down and separate evidence from wishful thinking. That is a healthy discipline, though not always an enjoyable one. It teaches us to look at what is really there. The coffer, the shafts, the quarry marks, the relieving spaces, the lower chamber, the hidden barriers, the void above the gallery. It teaches us not to despise small findings because they fail to match large fantasies. And it teaches us that a monument can still be generous even when it never fully explains itself. So if you are lying there now, letting the day settle, and the question still turns quietly in the mind, what was found in the Great Pyramid's hidden chambers, the calmest answer may be this. We found rooms, but also reasons to be careful with rooms. We found empty spaces, but also evidence that emptiness can be part of design. We found traces of workers in places meant only to support the work. We found barriers in shafts too small for human entry. We found unfinished depths below the known route. We found a great hidden void above one of the monument's most famous interior passages. We found again and again that the pyramid is not empty in the ordinary sense. It is full of intention, even where it is short on explanation. And maybe that is enough for tonight. Not enough to end the subject forever, because the pyramid does not really allow that. Not enough to make every argument disappear, because old monuments never stop attracting new certainty from people who have not yet learned caution. But enough to leave us in the right frame of mind. The Great Pyramid does not need to hand over one final secret to justify our attention. It has already done something harder. It has kept a human conversation alive across thousands of years with stone, geometry, hidden spaces and silence. That is an achievement of its own, and the longer you sit with it, the more natural it begins to feel that the monument's quietest chambers are the ones that still have the most to say, especially once the lights are low and the mind has stopped demanding that every important thing speak all at once.